you won't even know necessarily this has happened, but you've been hacked. And it's now projecting a visual and auditory feed where you believe that you're still walking in the woods, seeing this triangular craft and these grays. But if someone walked past you, they would just see you standing frozen, doing nothing at all. And there would be nothing around. They wouldn't see anything, just you were zoned out because you are being fed that experience.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It's back-to-back Tuesdays. This is almost unheard of. We have another episode after having one last week. Reason being is because it's on the UFO topic again. We recorded an episode a couple days after the Congressional hearing last week, and we do comment on it, so we wanted to get it out as soon as possible for you guys. So it's relevant, and who knows what's going to happen next week or the week after that. So we wanted to get it done. It is a long one. It clocks in at 3 hours, but it's solid. Okay, we go down a lot of different rabbit holes, cover a lot of different aspects of the UFO phenomenon, things that, you know, you don't necessarily read about or hear talked about a lot because it is some of it is kind of dark, or not very, uplifting, just by seeing a craft and getting awestruck. But so definitely it's worth the listen or watch if you're watching this on YouTube. Before we get started, please email us if you have any topics you want to see covered or guests you want to see on the show. We will do our best to get them on, and we appreciate everyone who messages us. podcast@dadsdoomsdayguide.com, podcast@dadsdoomsdayguide.com. Also, if you can, follow us on Twitter. If you're on social media, I know it tends to be kind of poisonous sometimes, but if you're on it, check us out. We're trying to build that account up at Doomsday Dads. At Doomsday Dads is the Twitter. If you prefer just to follow us on YouTube, we're here if you're listening to this. Or TikTok, if you want to see short snippets, that's at Dad's Doomsday Guide. At Dad's Doomsday Guide is the one for TikTok. Today's guest is author and researcher Bruce R. Fenton. You can find him on Substack and Twitter, which you can find the links for in the description below. He is the author of Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, and The Forgotten Exodus, The Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. You can find both those books on Amazon or your local bookseller. Without further delay, let's get straight to the interview. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. I guess to start, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Congressional UAP hearing yesterday. Now, it's been something that I've been really interested in for a long time, just UFO stuff since I was a kid, but I've been kind of in and out of it lately because I've been increasingly frustrated with this whole disclosure thing. It seems like it's going to happen, then it doesn't happen. There's proof. But anyway, they hyped this up a lot. What were your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the way that it was presented, was, I would say, very good. If you were wanting to do a kind of a public relations exercise, as a government institution, I think that was kind of really, really well done in that kind of model. They presented it very professionally. There was no silly season stuff, no X-Files music or really silly comments, from anybody.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was a little bit of skepticism in places, which is there should be, right? But all of the Congress people, they seem to have, a kind of a background understanding and obviously been either briefed or had their aides, do some basic research into the topic and what was happening. So nobody came in sounding, completely ignorant or stupid. So in that respect, I think it was, it was kind of well presented, and it did reduce the stigma around the topic. That would be what I would say is one of the outcomes. Is that people are going to look at that and say, "Wow, it looks as though the government's taking this topic fairly seriously." So perhaps there is something to this. Now, I would say if you came in as a person who was open to believing things without much evidence, you would quite likely come out of that believing that there was some kind of, agenda to hide alien craft. If you're a person who went into it who doesn't really believe things without evidence, then you won't come out of it believing because there was no evidence presented, right? So in that respect, it didn't change things for the skeptics much.
Yeah, the only person who drove me crazy, because I watched it last night, because I saw highlights all day, and I finally sat down and watched the whole thing. But I think her name was it Mrs. Fox or Miss? I don't know. She asked some question about how the head of AARO, is it Fitzpatrick? Is that his name? Yeah. How he's saying there's nothing, basically. There's no evidence of anything. And then you have Grusch who's saying there is evidence, and I've given it to him. And then she asked that question, like, why is there the discrepancy there? And then he was about to explain like what he did differently, I think, in kind of like talking to these witnesses and the evidence that he gave him. And then she like cut him off and then gave her a little spiel about how important it is. So and I was like, shut up. Like, just let him finish that. Cause that's one of my, I guess, questions to you is, why is there such a discrepancy between those two gentlemen? Like, what do you, I mean, do you think someone's lying here? I mean, there's that Fitzpatrick gentleman has been dumped on a lot in terms of being, he's some kind of government employee, and how can you trust the government to investigate itself and all this other stuff? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, poor old Dr. Fitzpatrick is pretty much being seen as some kind of skinwalker.
Yeah.
He's escaped from the ranch, and he is now blocking disclosure almost single-handedly.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has become sort of the monster of the story, which is I find very ironic, because if you sort of rewind a little bit, you have a handful of Congress people and senators that were seemingly very engaged with the UFO or UAP topic, and they kind of pushed for a new body to investigate. And of course, that's how we've ended up with AARO kind of coming out of the UAP task force. They wanted a more expanded organization rather than 3 people sitting in a room working part-time on the UFO problem, which was essentially what the UAP task force was. So AARO is, kind of an entire department with funding, with a larger team. I understand several dozen people, I think they now expanding out to. So this is kind of what the community also apparently wanted, of interested UFO people, was this idea, it's being taken seriously. And they've supported these senators and Congress people in this initiative right up to the point that AARO exists. They've brought in this, quite respected military scientist, Kirkpatrick, so it all seemed fine. And yet now he's being painted as this enemy. And I find that's quite ironic, because that in itself is a conflict. So you've said that these Congress people, senators are doing the right thing. Great idea. They're on board with disclosure, apparently. They've chosen this guy. So how do we square that? How do you support these senators and their department, but then say that this guy's evil and that's the guy that they've paid to run the department? So surely then you'd have to question the people that have founded the department as well and their motives, right? And that seems to be missing. It's all on this one guy. And then on top of that, I mean, he's seemingly is quite open-minded. He co-authored a paper with Avi Loeb from Harvard, and in that, open to the idea that, an extraterrestrial craft could come here and send out probes. He's not saying it has, but saying, we have to be open-minded to what we might encounter, in our solar system, in our terrestrial environment. Quite open-minded, And then on top of that, there's suggestions, certainly from the journalist Stephen Greenstreet, that Kirkpatrick was in a room with other intelligence officers and with Brandon Fugel, who owns Skinwalker Ranch, and that apparently in the conversation there, Kirkpatrick had kind of said, you can skip, I'm paraphrasing, but you can kind of skip the argument for there being extraordinary, UFOs that we already know. So that's kind of funny, because if he's already convinced there is something extraordinary, then is what we're seeing some kind of front? The skepticism that he's presenting, is that an act? Is that a front? Will we at some point see the sudden shift of Kirkpatrick and that he is now on board? And that would have quite a profound effect, because, again, when you build up the bogeyman, if the bogeyman then suddenly turns and says, I give up, you're right, the evidence is overwhelming, that's far more powerful than having a yes man in there from day one who is just, parroting the agenda, the popular story for everyone. Because that could bring on board some of the skeptics, because if they kind of resonate what he's been saying and then say, well, even Kirkpatrick's changed his mind, that could be what's happening. Or conversely, he really is just weighing it up, as a scientist, and is not impressed by what he's seen, at least not impressed enough to say that these peculiar objects and these peculiar types of phenomena we're seeing in our skies, they do require more data to explain them, but they are not strange enough that we need to invoke aliens at this point.
So if you were put on the hotspot right now, as of right now, a snap judgment, you would say he's just hasn't seen enough to convince himself that there is something, you think?
That's what I would go with at the moment. I mean, I haven't got any reason to infer Otherwise, again, because we haven't seen the extraordinary evidence that would force us to invoke aliens either.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate he's got access to data we don't have. But one of the things he has clarified a few times is that in many cases where we have videos or imagery of things that seem quite extraordinary, he doesn't have enough additional data to really ever solve those mysteries. And so there's an interpretation in the public that what he's almost saying is, therefore they're aliens, right? That, you know, the default of an unexplained object, because the government and the military are so all-knowing, right, that they cannot fail to identify something unless it's aliens. And that's, of course, is a really a kind of bogus argument. Yeah. Because, you know, if all you've got is, you know, one lot of sensor data, you know, or just a shoddy video recording, you know, how is he meant to deduce whether a silver orb flying along is an alien probe or it's a balloon painted silver released into high winds? Mm-hmm. You know, there's no real way for him to ever solve some of those cases. Yeah. And that's, I think is mainly the situation he has. That's what he's insinuating anyway.
Now, when I heard Grusch talking, I think he added an extra little wrinkle onto his interviewing witnesses, because I think one of the main criticisms, I think from Green Street and others, is that there's like the small group of people who are like fanatical UFO crazies, and they've convinced Congress and everybody else that there's UFOs, and now they've started this whole thing. But then in his interview, he said that he talked to over 40 people. Now, do you think that if it is accurate, kind of dispels the rumor that it's just like this Elizondo crew that's kind of taken Congress hostage? Do you buy into that there is this element inside? Because if there is, that's a huge problem. I mean, others have said that too. I mean, one way or another, you have to find out what's going on.
Right.
But when you hear Grusch and you listen to him, do you find him credible? Obviously, has a good track record, a good resume. When he makes that 40-person claim, and that he's, you know, spent 4 years, like, you know, cross-examining people and fact-checking things. What do you make of that?
Well, it certainly changes the story that Green Street has presented, that, you know, is particularly this small group of people whose names we know, you know, that have been up from, you know, former UAP task force members, particularly, you know, have been front and center of the narrative and of the story that Green Street is discussing. You know, we've got basically the former head, you know, of the UAP task force, their top scientist, and now, you know, one of their kind of main intelligence people, that are all kind of coming out with these stories about aliens having been, you know, identified in the data, right? And then acquaintances of them, you know. So obviously we know, like, for example, Elizondo knows Grusch, and he knows these, you know, the UAP task force head, and they also seem to know people like Pies, who came out with these strange charts of possible crafts. You know, he's associated with Space Force, and so is Elizondo's associated with Space Force now. So a lot of people, they interact, they know each other. So we can understand that there is a potential there for a web of people, you know, talking to each other, influencing each other, and possibly, you know, collaborating on an initiative to change the discourse for whatever reason. That's quite reasonable. But yeah, when you add in, I suppose, these 30 other people, you have to say then there's more than just what we've seen, this network of associated intelligence, military, and scientists, you know, who may well be doing, at least in some ways, some of what Green Street suggested, that, you know, they have motive or an agenda that we may not know, and they've collaborated to influence the way this topic is considered. And that, I think, is at least in part true, because we've seen that these people have influenced the way that this topic is considered. I mean, that's real. Mm-hmm. Whether the motive is for self-interest or is for the public, I think that's the only part that's a question there. But then when we add on these other 30 or so witnesses, I mean, the first thing I say is that although that sounds like a lot, right, at the same time, think of the vast size of the US intelligence community. I mean, so it would seem that a tiny fraction of people, you know, are aware of this and concerned enough to speak out. You know, you would imagine that this actually involves a lot more people. And if people were willing to talk to Grusch in this kind of candid way, that you would expect there to be quite a lot of other people that knew about this. Mm-hmm. And that they now have the same opportunity to come forward. So it's not a huge number of people all considered. So this certainly could still be within a network of people that know each other, right? It's not an enormous number. If we had, they said, you know, we were getting hundreds of whistleblowers from these programs that you knew all about this, or other people that heard these accounts from people, you know, which is not unrealistic if there was widespread discussions within the intelligence community. And to be honest, most people have heard of the claims of various ex-military and ex-intelligence people over the last few decades. So I would assume that most people in that world know at least of the mythology and the legends of people whistleblowing on UFO recovery programs, going back to Roswell, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something they would be aware of. And I would have thought many would be interested in poking around saying, well, is that true? You know, now that I have, you know, a high level of clearance, I'm going to have a little poke around. Do we really have aliens, right? I mean, so it's still not beyond the possibility that these are people that are all associated. And it'd be very interesting to see if any of these 30 people are also names that are familiar to us from over the years, because that is also unclear at the moment, right? That we may find that several of these other whistleblowers actually are from that group, mm-hmm. right? So that's another unknown. So I'd be very interested to see. Of course, it does add some credibility. It does make you feel that there's the potential here that they are not all associated, and you might genuinely have concerns from different departments, you know, people that have encountered things that they think, at the very least, are associated with some kind of rogue project that's taking government funds, doing strange research that appears to be associated with the recovery of anomalous vehicles, mm-hmm. or, you know, genetic studies of what seem to be non-humans, you know, and that they've encountered enough of the information around that to make them feel that they should come forward. I mean, that, of course, it may be a mix of both. We might find that several of these people are associated, and there's a few that have come out because they've independently heard things or seen files that suggest this. One of the problems there, just I could say, is that we also know that in the past there were generated quite a lot of kind of rather spoof kind of, you know, intelligence documents that kind of suggested that such programs existed. And these were sometimes created deliberately by kind of counterintelligence and stuff to run disinformation campaigns around legitimate programs and suggest that, you know, that really that there was, you know, alien technology involved. So it's not beyond possibility that they may have seen what looked like legitimate documents, you know, that indicate recovery of a craft, and that what they're looking at is documents created as parts of, you know, an intelligence program to cover up, you know, US secret research. I mean, so we're really in the dark with that, because, you know, of course, it's a shady world of manipulating perception and utilizing people as assets. I mean, you know, that's part of that world. So we have to be very, very cautious and not always jump to what seems like a logical conclusion, mm-hmm. because, you know, it's not a world that's based around wanting people to easily jump to logical conclusions and work out what the hell's going on, right? That's pretty much the opposite of what you want in the intelligence world.
Do you have confidence that Congress will actually have any backbone? Because, like, I mean, even if you go into that, it's politicians and people getting paid and people involved in different, you know, I think there was one criticism of some man on that in the hearing who had ties to some company, and he was kind of stonewalling them actually writing any legislation to kind of find this stuff out. So when I look at that, I go, man, are they ever going to get any information? Because, you know, Grusch is sitting there going, hey, you get me in that private hearing or private meeting, and I'll give you names, I'll give you locations, I'll give you, and it's like watching that, you're like, oh my God, he's going to spill the beans. But then mm-hmm. I don't have any confidence that's going to happen. Do you?
No, and you have no way of validating what's happened. I mean, I put a tweet up today, you know, asking, should be the logical question. If you think about it, I mean, if there was a rogue nuclear missile that gone missing and that intelligence was gathered showing where this nuclear missile was, you know, who had it, where it was right now, what level of priority would you expect the intelligence community and the military world to put on recovering that? Would you expect it to be an operation launched in months, weeks, days, hours? Because a rogue program holding an alien craft is dealing with something just as potentially dangerous as a nuclear missile, if not more so. Mm-hmm. What if it's something that if you drill into its power source, it blows half the planet apart, right? You think about it, we would have no idea the capabilities of something like that. So you would have to treat that as dangerous, at least, as a rogue nuclear missile. And yet, the kind of narrative being spun to us now is, be patient, over the next few months, we're going to hear something. Now, think about that. Does that make sense to you if you put that kind of logic in? Because that's the sense we're being given, is that this will gradually be dealt with. If you were sitting in, say the Central Intelligence Agency or NSA or somewhere, and someone's telling you that, well, there's this object, we think it can blow half the world up, but hey, I've got this other stuff I want you to go on with, be like, we've got to deal with this now. This is like my family, everybody, we could all be destroyed. We need to get this. I mean, so to me, that doesn't make, if this isn't jumped on instantly, then something's very wrong, because we're being told that Grusch has given them the locations, the project names, the lists of the people involved, both hostile and friendly witnesses, all of it. A data dump is being given to Congress and therefore onto the rest of the intelligence community and, whoever the government wants to utilize for this. I mean, I could understand maybe it taking a few days, but if we're being sold the idea that over the next few years, we're going to hear more about this, I think we should really, really be super, super skeptical that this is the kind of thing that you could allow to just be persisting in the background. And also, we've been told there's criminal offenses, money is being rerouted and, That
was so interesting when I heard that. He's specifically saying, I can show you how they're doing it. They're, because they do lose tons of money every year. And like, where's that going? We have no idea. And you're kind of like, well, obviously you guys are using it for something. You just don't want us to know what it is.
Right.
But to your point about being logical about it, that doesn't equate to aliens. It's like it could be any kind of number of clandestine projects they're working on with normal tech.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever personally been contacted by anybody in the government or intelligence officials? And you're kind of like, hey, who is this? I know Dr. Masters was talking about he has been contacted before. Have you ever been approached by someone claiming to have knowledge about this stuff or trying to give you information?
Only in the context of them saying that they liked my work and that there were people in that world that like my work, but that not to the thing of getting into a conversation about me utilizing any information or forming a kind of relationship where I would be bringing anything out from them or using them as a source. No. So just the context of someone saying that, they are in that world and that there are people that watch what I do and that find my work is better than most of what they're seeing happening in this field, which was great. I didn't really follow up. I didn't go checking to confirm that they had the positions they said, because my policy really is that I'm not interested in using insider sources and, whether military intelligence, I'm just not interested in it, because I know it leads you down a road that, is problematic as a kind of a research, and, you can become dependent on that. You can't fact check most of it. So again, it's a kind of becomes a belief-based relationship, right? Yeah. I'm always trying to minimize the level of belief. So, what I see from other people who do utilize these sources, to me, is information that comes out that's quite frustrating, because it's claims of, that they say that, it's basically the situation is like this, but there's no way for you to validate it. And these people are putting it out there, having done no rigorous fact checking on whether what they're saying is accurate. So, I mean, to me, it doesn't seem to add anything. If anything, it pollutes the clarity of the discourse that we're having. So I can understand that there may be people who would love to bring stuff out and they are maybe telling people the truth, but I think unless they can support what they're saying, again, I don't find that you automatically have some kind of increased credibility just because you work for DARPA or the NSA or something, that you're still a human being, still fallible. And if anything, of course, you could have motive to seed disinformation. I mean,
that's the thing, is like, I see it on both sides. Like I see it for believers and non-believers. It's like, if you're being fed information from the government or someone claiming to be from the government, like, how do you know that's accurate information one way or another? I mean, you just at that point become kind of a tool and a mouthpiece for whatever narrative they're spinning. I mean, there's the history of that with the CIA doing that with news outlets and planning stories and like giving them a little piece and they run with it.
Mm-hmm.
So how are they presenting themselves to you? Is it just, hey, I'm so-and-so and I work at this agency? Are they giving you kind of like a wink, hey, you're on the right track? Or when they're talking about liking your work, do you get any kind of sense about what they're fishing for or looking to get or give you?
Just in private conversation, voice conversation, in secure applications, about some of the looking at the community and seeing that, that there is a narrative that is being given out, which they're aware of, and that some of it that they are not happy with. They would like to see the conversation move forward faster to some of the more serious topics, some of the more serious evidential aspects of the UFO aliens topic, and that they consider it at the moment to be mostly a sea of rubbish, and that they know that there's other groups that want it to move very slowly, and that their opinion is that their group is it should move a bit faster, and that they're again, this is, I'm told that they feel they should leap on more towards the direction I've gone with my work, which is substantiating with evidence visitation rather than the slow process of things like, say, Galileo Project, where they're building the detectors and they're going to hopefully put them out around the world over the next few years and gradually see if there's something, which is great, it's scientific, but very slow. Mm-hmm. Or conversely, the kind of the mishmash of belief stuff that you have in the UFO world. I believe this and I believe that, which isn't really going far. I'm just looking at videos, which again is not really taking us very far, that they don't feel that the way it's being handled by some of the other, I suppose, sources and groups that are involved in the community, and that there are quite a lot. I mean, I would take that for granted anyway, that there's quite a lot of that involvement. Historically, there's always been a lot of seeding of narratives through sources into the UFO world. So it's not surprising that still happens today. So that again, but I'm not validating everything they said. I didn't go out of my way to check it because, like I said, I don't utilize those sources. So it was interesting to hear that. So it didn't affect the way I work. But if that's true, it's interesting to hear. And it was nothing that I don't really already kind of think that, there's a deliberate, slow level of progress in this topic, which I think is the agenda of some interest groups that may be going back to this idea of destabilizing society, that, if too much is shown too quick, maybe that could be for other reasons. Obviously paradigm changes are destabilizing. So if there is the evidence that we have, say, an alien intelligence in our solar system, that revelation to be, factually, objectively shown, that revelation would have some destabilizing effects on the structure of our society, right? Particularly a hierarchical society where at the top really is the government systems, the intelligence community, the military, all of those systems. Naturally, they kind of sit at the top of the hierarchy. But if you validate the presence of a civilization that can travel the vastness of space, right? Well, where do you put that intelligence?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to put that straight at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right? Immediately. Who cares what Biden thinks? I want to know what Zark, conqueror of the galaxy, thinks. That's a problem. And there's a paper by, I think he's a political historian. I'm trying to think, I might get the name of it, but he writes about how we have this kind of anthropocentric problem with aliens. On that basis, partly this idea that we almost can't have aliens in the system because of that, because it's kind of this Pandora's box problem for the hierarchy, that the only aliens really they could safely have are aliens that they in some way control. So those aliens would have to be either dead, like I say, an extinct civilization, or a crashed craft, maybe, but something that is not an active player in the story, or aliens that they generate through, a fictional account, a story that they are weaving. So they can have an emission of aliens, but those aliens would have to be, the story would have to be in their control. If it was a story that involves the aliens being present, active, and out of their control, that could be very destabilizing for our hierarchical systems. So I think when you look at it that way, you start to see that it's almost impossible for the kind of system we have to just come out and say, yes, a type 2 civilization is active in our solar system, and we believe it's active on Earth. That is a problem, not in the way most people think. Not that, the markets will panic. It's a panic for people that are holding on to control. And that's something that is a much bigger motive for people to keep a topic quiet. If we look at many topics being silenced, why are topics particularly silenced? They have in some way a weaponizing aspect against some hierarchical group, some power structure, so they will silence that narrative. So I think that's the problem we have in this. And it's because most people won't be freaked out. So we hear these stories, that, people would panic and, Yeah, I mean, some people would, but if you can get over the fact that you are doomed, right? You're doomed. I'm doomed. Right? We're all doomed. So, we live with that, right? We know that we're all doomed, right? We're not going to survive. We're not coming out of this game alive. Yeah. So there's already an existential crisis that all humans have to deal with. Yeah. And we managed to go on, go skiing and go jet and do all this stuff, not thinking about too much about that. So we could process the additional potential threat of aliens, in the same way that we have all sorts of potential threats. I don't buy the idea that would stay as a long-term existential threat. People would soon acclimatize, because the one thing humans are really good at is acclimatizing.
Yeah.
I don't believe that is the real motive. Like we've had that conversation many times, the idea that people are protecting us from some kind of great panic. And I think that if you look closer to this other argument, it makes way more sense, because we already believe in all sorts of stuff. We believe in there's gods and there's angels, and there's an awful lot of people whose current beliefs are not that different from accepting the presence of an alien civilization, right? Because if you can accept that there are these like transcendent beings like angels that can do amazing things. People believe they've been healed by angels. They've seen angels. Angels have come down and fought demons. And, if you can believe that, or you can believe that Vishnu's there and Ganesha and that they're helping you out and stuff, right? There is not a big leap from that to that there is some kind of cosmic civilization that does stuff out there in the vastness of space, right? That's not that hard for the human mind to contend with. So I think a lot of people should just rethink who would have the most vested interests in holding back such information, and why, and what is the kind of the threat that's really involved in revealing that. And that's why I think you'll find that a lot of this story that we're being presented and kind of woven to us is a story that is under the control of the hierarchical system, right? Mm-hmm. It's now gone all the way to the point where almost the entire story of UFOs and aliens is being provided to us by either current or former intelligence, military, and political figures. And that's quite wild, because go back a few decades and, well, even probably 10, 20 years even, and you'd find that most people were just pointing to people saying, I think you're with the government. I'm not listening. The whole UFO world was always full of that kind of paranoia. You're an agent, and yet now it's actually, those are the people you're looking at as the agents and saying they're the heroes of disclosure. So that in itself is quite an amazing turnaround for a topic that used to be so paranoid of the state's involvement and of the military and intelligence involvement. And yet now it's gone all the way to, no, those are the people that we should be listening to.
For you, if it is bogus, and that's, you try to play these games, and like you talked about earlier, it's not an industry based on truth, or, it's all deception and all counterintelligence and whatnot. But if it is bogus, I've tried to think about this, like, what's in it for the government to keep going down this road and rabbit hole of, like, it seems like it's becoming more of a pain for them than it is now to help cover up anything else. Like, if you really want extra funding, all you got to do is scare people about China, Russia. I mean, you can get a lot of funding. You can get a lot of funding for space. Like, hey, they're going to put missiles in space. Like, you can drum up a lot of war business that way. So what if it is bogus? Like, it's hard for me to kind of connect the dots about why is it worth it to keep this narrative going for such a long time too. Like, you talk about Project Blue Book and everything else. Do you have any, do you ever go down that rabbit hole in your head? Like, why would they be doing this if it was all phony?
Well, I don't think you can say it's all phony. I don't think you can say it's all bogus. Again, there's a legitimate phenomena, at the heart of this, because, irrespective of what the intelligence community are doing, I think, people have extraordinary experiences, right? So, there's people that encounter, at least if you're willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, because again, if you're not there, you didn't see it, or they don't have any data, but there's an awful lot of people that report having encounters with anomalous phenomena. Now, that might be orbs of light, which seems a very common thing. And we know that strange orbs of light do fly around in our skies. They have been recorded. And, there's the designation of ball lightning. Nobody knows what ball lightning is. We don't, it's not lightning. That's about what we know about ball lightning. Oh, and it's shaped like a ball. Right? But we don't even know if that's a plasma phenomena. That's one of the kind of the hypotheses. Nobody knows. Right? So that could be an alien intelligence flying around as a ball of energy? Nobody knows, right? So we have these legitimate mysteries, and people see craft that by their descriptions sound extraordinary, right? That appears to be the case. And sometimes those craft are recorded on radar. In some cases, there's what seems to be landing of unusual circular, craft, and soil samples taken where it's landed are unusual. Yeah, they exhibit radiation, they're compacted, water runs off the soil, there's changes chemically in the soil. That's extraordinary. Nobody knows what's causing those changes, right? So if you can have a witness account and you have some physical evidence backing it up, there's enough to say that, at least in some of these cases, it seems that there is extraordinary phenomena that is as yet unexplained, right? We don't know if that's aliens. We don't have to jump to that. We don't know that ball lightning's conscious and not just a natural phenomena. We don't know if these things that people see that look like landed saucers are alien or something else. But I think we have enough to say that there is genuine encounters with extraordinary, unexplained, or poorly explained phenomena. And that's had to be reckoned with by like Project Blue Book and other organizations that have looked at this and have concluded that in at least a proportion of cases, there is something that's quite astonishing that has occurred, right? So this is the problem. We can't really just go one to the other, that, is it all real? Is it all rubbish? And I think as humans, we're kind of evolved to sort of do that. Is this important? Yes, no. Should I deal with it? Yes, no. Is it danger? Is it safe? No. Right. Whereas, this is a much more nuanced thing. It's almost something that's kind of outside of our normal kind of cognitive reality in our evolutionary history. It's like another factor that it was neither beneficial or negative for our evolution. I think it's in a kind of a weird blind spot, that there's phenomena that don't seem to really matter. And so we have a kind of a strange relationship with phenomena like that. And it's only now with the progression of technologies and stuff that there's a potential to look at some of these and say, oh, maybe we could explain that, because 1,000 years ago, it would have just been written off as magic or something, right? But we're at a point where now we can say, well, these phenomena exist. We should look at them. We should try to understand them. And they might actually support visitation from some kind of other intelligence, right? So if that is at least part of the story as well, the military, the intelligence world, the government, aspects of those communities, and again, those are not like one structure, right? But you could imagine that there is within that structure groups or individuals who take that seriously. That we've seen that with like Blue Book and stuff, right? So there are people who feel, well, we can't just ignore it. Even just from the reporting problem angle, which is what the Air Force used to have. People were reporting this stuff to the Air Force, right? Mm-hmm. So they're like, what do we do about it? We have to do something, And so they eventually launched this investigation. And one of the things they concluded was that, it was kind of a pain because this was clogging up their lines, people wanting to report this stuff and having to dedicate people to it and really not able to do anything with it. They couldn't resolve it. They weren't really having to engage an enemy. What good was the data for them based on the job they have been given by the government, right? So they kind of got to a point, they almost like, we just want rid of this topic. And I think there was one of the officers who said, if only the damn things could swim, then it'd be the Navy's problem. And it's kind of funny because now look, it's the Navy's problem. It's been the Navy, right? And that's kind of ironic because they didn't want anything to do with them. There's been a lot of, talk about where is the Air Force in all this? Historically, the Air Force, they did this. And I don't think they want back in because it's kind of a headache that nobody wants, right?
Yeah.
Because what do they do with it? They know that they've been down that road, that, they don't really benefit from engaging a lot of resources to the UFO issue. Now, I will say one thing has changed, because before it made sense if you were going to move away from that research to kind of discredit it and also downplay it. And part of that is creating stigma around reporting. That, it was basically thought it's a waste of time. We don't want to know about this stuff. That's at least seems to be part of the official position. So creating stigma around that is kind of helpful because you're freeing up that time again. Most people don't want to talk about it and you feel it's a waste of time. Great, win-win. Yeah. But what has changed is that in the last, obviously in the last few decades particularly, we've seen this steep incline in drone use. and the movement towards drone warfare, right? Future wars are going to be mainly drone wars. It's going to be pretty obvious. So in that climate, if you have most of your military personnel fearful of reporting strange objects in the air, that is really, really dangerous. Because if you think about it, if you think like an enemy power, say the US moved towards hostility with China, I mean, I'd hope not, because that'd be absolutely horrendous. But, if China was to employ saucer-shaped drones and fly them over air bases to drop toxins or something. I mean, imagine that the security are too freaked out by seeing saucers, right, that they don't want to report what they're seeing. I mean, that is super dangerous. And you can make these drones look like almost anything you want now, and drone swarms that can appear and look like a sort of large object, but then can disperse, magically vanish, stuff like that. So things that used to be associated with the UFO phenomena are now associated with the military capabilities of rivals, right? So that's one of the things I think why we've seen in the last few years, particularly this thing of we must remove the stigma around reporting UFOs, because that is a key military concern, right? And it's a very logical one, because China and Russia don't have that problem, not as much. They never went down the road of really stigmatizing these things, okay? But like someone said, in China, you can pretty much talk about whatever you want, just not criticize the government. So they say it's kind of funny. He said in the US, it's different. There's lots of stuff you can't talk about, but you can criticize the government. In China, that's the only thing off limit. So they've never had a problem about paranormal phenomena, psychic stuff, or UFOs. That's not been considered something that the government needed to control the topic, right? So they don't have that issue. The US has got that issue, and we're seeing a massive effort to destigmatize. That, I would suggest, is one big part of why you're seeing so much effort put into that as they move towards potential drone wars, both on Earth and in space. And again, space is a concern because we are moving towards space wars. So, the idea that there's objects that go from space to Earth and that we need to understand what's in this space domain. And so, I think there's a problem sometimes in ufology is that the disconnect from other topics and what's happening in our world, and how that would influence the conversation around UFOs in the official world. But certainly the move towards space warfare, that definitely is, I think, related to what we're seeing. Again, the connections here with some of the people to Space Force and the idea that, in the past, there's been a lot of people who suspected Space Force was maybe to do with defending Earth from aliens and things like that, that was kind of certainly in the kind of, the conspiratorial or UFO communities. A lot of people wondering, is it because they know the aliens are coming? And these kind of ideas. But, well, really, although you can't say that's impossible, I mean, what we do know is that they are moving towards wanting to take resources on asteroids and the moon. China's looking to establish a base in the South Pole of the moon. Russia's saying about that Venus should be theirs because they had the first probe there and stuff. So the thing is, this just happening. It's bubbling away in the background. That there's this movement towards drone warfare in space. And again, so there's a lot of concern around drones, novel drones, technologies for moving around up there, what's up there, and policing that environment.
Yeah, it almost makes you kind of, well, for me, it makes me think like just the older cases. That's unfortunately we didn't have the same like reconnaissance capabilities to like view the imagery, and the satellite probably is so much better now. But now you have so much more pollution in terms of what you're talking about, drones and high tech and all those other things. So now it's like, good luck. I mean, maybe it is that 1 to 5% of cases that are truly anomalous and like, what the heck is that? But sifting that out from the sea of mess that's there. But getting to kind of like what you mentioned earlier about alien intervention, or have they visited or not? And I know you've written a lot about this. Extraterrestrial, I guess, tinkering with human evolution. Now, when I talked to Dr. Masters, he was a believer of future humans being the aliens and coming back and time traveling and kind of doing things for their own benefit, not necessarily to help us in our evolution. Now, I think you, and correct me if I'm wrong, would differ from that in thinking that they actually have manipulated, and you can get into kind of the terminology here about the brain evolution and like the size of the head and all that stuff. Can you talk a little bit about, one, how you came to this research? I know you're an author, and how did you start kind of unraveling these markers in evolution and what you're kind of focusing on in making that argument?
I mean, I'm obviously with the other arguments for time travel, and again, first of all, I'd say many things could be true. But I will say with time travel that the physics community in general, is very, very skeptical of the idea that you could come back and change things in that way. There's obviously a whole smorgasbord of reasons why. Apart from the kind of sense that it's probably impossible to time travel, which may not be true, but there's at the moment the sense is it's probably impossible. No one can say it's impossible. But then the energy that would be required to have some kind of technology to do that, the potential to change things and sort of break the fabric of reality. So although I wouldn't discount it, and I do understand some of the argument that is being made, when you look at the typical image of the Greys, they do look like a kind of a super neotenous human that's evolved in such a way as it's become more and more neotenous. And people that are not familiar with neoteny is the retention of infant traits into adulthood. So when you look at the Greys, they have this kind of very big head, very frail body, very hairless, very flat, underdeveloped face. And these are things that we associate more with fetal humans, right? So you're kind of saying if you look at them, they're almost like a fetus, as though we've gone down this process of greater and greater neoteny to the point where we're retaining almost all the looks of a human fetus into our adulthood. And we've become these strange Greys that people see.
And what would be the reason for that if that was happening? If it was us, is there like a evolutionary reason why that would start progressing that way?
Well, humans actually, we do tend to interbreed with favoring neotenous traits. So we are reinforcing that. So if you're selecting mates, and there's a connection as well between more neotenous men, even in evolutionary terms, being more caring towards children. I think there was an argument, but also so there was there was useful characteristics associated with those people. And then so if you think about it, so if a woman sees that a man with a certain look is more likely to be more caring, so they breed more. So you reinforce that. So and then the men are attracted to neotenous women, so having a slightly younger look. And so if you look at East Asian women, they are highly neotenous, and so they appear to stay younger looking much further into their adulthood. I mean, to be honest, sometimes you can see women who are like 50 or 60 in East Asia who look 20, right? That's not that rare because they are quite neotenous. They have flat faces and much more childlike, what we'd think are features in terms of Eurasian features, right? So that's neoteny. But so there's a favoring of neotenous traits in humans over time. So we've been getting more and more neotenous. So if you extrapolate that out, and if you imagine thousands of years from now, if that trend continued, we would become more and more like an infant human. And the other thing is with neoteny is that you also retain some of the beneficial traits of infant animals. So if you look at the way that infant animals are much more flexible than adults across most mammal species. They play, they do all sorts of learning activities. They are not yet stuck in their ways, so they're not specialized in the way that an adult in their species would be. So you might find, say, an ape that the adult may spend most of the time just finding one nut, cracking it, and feeding its young. It doesn't do a lot else. While the children are doing all sorts of learning activities and they are playing, and we are stuck in that kind of infancy. So if you look at humans, we are still very concerned with play all the way into our late adulthood, right? Whether you think about sports, computer games. Also, we're very flexible in that we can learn many things. We can change our career path completely. We can relearn a new skill, right? Even as an older person, you can say, okay, I was a biophysicist. I want to be a geographer or something. You can go and skill change. Most animals don't have that kind of flexibility with their sort of neural pathways. We do. And again, that is associated with being stuck in that kind of infancy of the brain, that we have a very, very flexible kind of brain structure in that way. So again, that is a beneficial trait. So if neoteny is providing beneficial traits and is desirable, you can see why it will become more and more reinforced over time. And so you probably will end up with a much more neotenous human thousands of years from now. So that part is, is based in a scientific understanding of what's happening to our species. So we may end up looking something like that, if not quite the Greys, but something approaching that form, with a larger and larger head and a smaller and frailer body, and particularly with the use of technologies, we're kind of, on that path.
What we're doing right now at a computer, yeah.
Right. So that, again, other things we're doing could reinforce that, as we don't need to be sort of as strong or anything. We may get more and more baby-like. So it's kind of funny. I got into the topic through a bit of a sort of side. I'm very interested in human origins, ancient mysteries, all of that. For years and years, been involved with that. I wrote a book on early hominins, the Forgotten Exodus, the Inter-Africa Theory of Human Evolution, back in 2017. It's got a forward from Graham Hancock, and it tackles the backstory of basically out of Africa and reset out of Africa, and a rewrite of that. And so my argument that those positions are wrong, but also tackling stories about the Denisovans, positioning the Denisovans' homeland down in Oceania, suggesting that humans reached Oceania probably around 900,000 years ago, and discussing Neanderthals as being more of an Asian species, not just as a European species, and all sorts of other stuff in there. So I was quite familiar with some of a lot of the studies in human origins and early migrations and the different arguments about different human species and stuff. So, and that came out of actually being in Ecuador. Go backwards. I ended up in Ecuador in 2012. And while I was there, I was in a chance meeting with someone who'd been into the Amazon jungle to a megalithic site, which they believed was a lost city of giants. Now, it was kind of funny, a chance meeting. I'm into these topics. I'm sitting in the room with this guy. He's saying he's just come back from the jungle, from this lost city of giants. I'm like, this is weird. I'm actually the only kind of, European, English-speaking researcher of those topics in 1,000 miles. And I happen to be in this kind of meeting with this guy and this shaman that we were going to see. And so that felt very fated. But so that led to me investigating what that site kind of represented, who may have constructed it. And eventually I came to the conclusion that it was probably the Lagoa Santa people were connected with it. And this is a site in the Yanganatis jungles. If anyone's familiar with Yanganatis, it's the area where allegedly the lost treasures of the Inca were taken after the killing of Atahualpa. It's a really inhospitable, swampy jungle, mountains, horrible conditions, great place to hide a load of silver if you want to make sure the Spanish can't get it. But it's also, there's all sorts of legends associated with the place. Strange things are seen there, UFOs and paranormal things, but also, strange sights, and including this one. Now, nearby was a cave where a lot of remains had been taken out back up in the 1920s, and these remains appeared to be the Lagoa Santa type. And Lagoa Santa are early humans from down in Brazil, in Lagoa Santa, Brazil, right? Now, they appear to be the earliest Americans. Now, there's some controversy around that, but there's sites down in that area, in that region, that suggest habitation 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Now, you might have seen just recently a paper came out showing that there was certainly human habitation there about, I think it was 26,000 years ago, with some pendants made from megafauna. So they know that these people are there before the Clovis people, right? These are not Clovis. These are definitely a pre-Clovis culture. They're long before the currently widely accepted arrival of pre-Clovis people in North America, which is now around about 17 to 20,000 years, depending on who you ask and what they're willing to believe. But this would position this as earlier than those pre-Clovis people in North America. If you look at other aspects of these sites, they suggest habitation going back to 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Right, that's wildly different to the main narrative we've been sold for decades, okay? So the thing about these Lagoa Santa is they have what's called like an Australoid skulls. So in other words, they have an Oceanian type look, appearing to be Aboriginal people of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Now, what are those people doing down in Brazil 50,000 years, 20 to 50,000 years ago? That didn't fit well. And so that's kind of what led me into these people, is this site, the link to them, and then realizing that this story really didn't fit with recent out of Africa, that somehow, some Africans wandered into Europe and into Eurasia around about 60,000 years ago. And yet somehow there's Aboriginal Australians in Brazil around the same time. So that dragged me into a bit of a mystery then. I had a lot of time on my hands when I was in Ecuador. So I kind of drilled down into the topic quite deeply and realized that actually there were some glaring anomalies that suggested to me that we had that story very wrong, and that in fact the earliest modern humans, fully modern humans, so behaviorally and anatomically modern humans, were in Oceania, Australasia, and parts of East Asia, and that this populating event of Eurasia and the Americas had begun in Australasia, and that you'd had movements of people going up into island Southeast Asia about 60,000 years ago-ish, and that also at the same time, from the bottom of the continent, people had moved along from Tasmania along the ice. And again, the ice was more extensive at this time, so you could just walk onto the ice. But they're using watercraft, so small boats and stuff. You could move along the ice from Australia to Tierra del Fuego, right? And you can just arrive in the tip of South America. And then, funnily enough, in Tierra del Fuego, the original people there, the culture of those people, there's a lot of elements that overlap with some of the indigenous tribes of Australia, including the attire and outfit, ceremonies and stuff that they had. And further to that, in Brazil, in the deep forests, they found tribes whose genomic profile includes signatures of Papua New Guinean people, of an ancient link, to Papua New Guineans. And not only that, I know I'm dropping a lot here before I get to aliens, but not only that, they have cultural overlaps, these people, because it turns out that when they look up at the sky, they look up at the dark rift in the Milky Way, they see a giant rhea bird stretched along the dark rift. Now, there's multiple tribes in Australia who, when they look up, they see an emu stretched along. The rhea and the emu are almost identical, closely related birds, almost identical. So these same people with this genetic marker of Australasia have the same cultural motifs. They have, and also mark their planting the crops to the rise of the Pleiades, something that is again seen amongst some of the tribes in Australia. So you've got genetics and culture that's suggesting that these people hold the remnants of a previous group, right? So they're not entirely Papuan, but they absorbed the remnants long, long ago of someone else who was there first.
Okay.
And that's we see down in Papua, we're seeing these remnants. Now, so why did that change? So that kind of, well, hopefully that's interesting back to, but that kind of led me into this talking about Australia, and that Australia having a very different story to the one we were told. And so I ended up getting into a project with some Australian researchers on this idea of being an out of Australia event rather than an out of Africa event. And it was through that, we'll go into the longer story of that, but it was through them that I made contact with a lady called Valerie Barrow, who was a friend of theirs. And she'd published a book back in 2003 or 2002 called Alcheringa, When the First Ancestors Were Created, right? And so that book is a story of an encounter she and other individuals had with an ancient artifact called a Cheringa, right? And a Cheringa is typically a handheld piece of sacred art, like an example, an oval stone engraved with geometric patterns would be one type. Sometimes there's wooden Cheringas, and they are considered to be like the receptacles of consciousness, that they are in some way alive, and they can represent almost the storehouse of your soul and your group soul for your soul group. They have kind of soul. In some of the cultures, they have a soul group, right? So you are associated with these artifacts. These artifacts are alive. And in the lore, and I go with the Arente people who are based near to Uluru, which people may know as Ayers Rock, but around that area, like in their lore, these first Cheringa were left here by the Alcheringa beings of the Alcheringa time. So the Dreamtime beings, creator beings that were walking the lands in the original creation time, and that some of them, they transform themselves into artifacts that would persist through time and be unchanging. And so they would be living artifacts and sources of knowledge that would be there alongside us throughout time. Also, who either left here or were actually the beings. Now, these artifacts were kept away from the general population, usually in caves, and they would be brought out during only sacred ceremonies and only ever handled by we call it the the clever fellas who were kind of like a high priest, like or a high shaman, the wisdom keepers of the tribe. No one else could handle them. The taboos around them in some cases was to have your eyes put out or to death. If you were to go in and just grab it, that often the taboo around it would be you put to death, right? So these were serious things, and most people were scared of them. They didn't want to handle them because there was a sense of fear around these artifacts, that they were in some way very, very powerful and a problem potentially if you got involved with them. So most people were very happy for them to stay in a cave and only be dealt with by these clever fellows who kind of like shamans, right? So let's give you a bit of a backstory. Now, what happened in the case of Barrow is that there was one of these artifacts that several decades ago, at least in the backstory they're told, and again, can't validate it, this is the backstory, is that there was a camel trader plying their wares across the desert. And in those days, they're the Afghan camel traders that would take goods around across the desert in Australia. Kind of a weird bit of history, but a fact. And so one of these guys, he found one of these chiringas in a cave near to Uluru. And it's described apparently as it was a softly glowing artifact, picked it up, took it, and then later tried to give it to some of the nearby tribespeople, and they wanted none of it, didn't want anything to do with it. Years and years later, I think it's a grandchild of that person, someone had given it to friends to give back to these people. She said, we'd rather it goes back to their traditional keepers. And so this lady had taken it on herself to do that. In the course of attempting to do this, she was hospitalized due to, she had an alcoholism problem. So she had liver and kidney issues. She had some severe things going on. She knew she was going to have to go into hospital. She wasn't going to be able to look after this artifact. She wanted to find somebody that would. And through her friend's kind of grapevine, she heard about Valerie. And Valerie lived in a house called Alcheringa. She'd chosen that name out, just out of the dictionary, thought, really nice name, and was also a regression therapist. And I'm not sure at the time, but she later became a psychic medium. So she was very much involved in, what we'd think of as, I suppose, alternative thought. She's definitely a bit of a new age person. She's, all that. So she was very open-minded. So she's heard of, this lady, she lives in a house called Alcheringa. I've got a chiringa from the Alcheringa time. Apparently, she's very open-minded, new age sort, the sort of person who might be open to looking after a weird sacred relic for a bit. So she went to her and asked, would you hold this until I come back out of hospital? And it was wrapped up in paper bark, which again, traditionally you shouldn't be looking on it. So although, you could say they're not fully in tradition, they shouldn't be anywhere near it. But so they did their best with it. And she said, well, yeah, put it in a shoebox, puts it in a back room, has no direct looking at it or touching it, but she puts this artifact away, and within a few weeks, in my understanding, she gets this kind of voice to skull kind of contact, some sort of telepathic type contact with this something, an entity, this consciousness saying, I'm Alcheringa, and basically a non-human entity, and that there's this history of humanity that you don't know about, that's been lost, and that I'm here to tell you to pass on this lost history. And so over a period of time, again, this is really wacky stuff. So over a period of time, she has all this information. And then a friend of hers is driving nearby. I know there's quite a lot too, so I'll try not to get the whole thing, but I'll let you jump back in. But just give the backstory. So there's a friend of hers who's driving nearby with an Aboriginal elder called Gerry Bostock. And he was a very respected man. He was a playwright, a writer, former Australian soldier, and also a healer, and all sorts of very respected guy in his community. He's in the car, and this friend says, I know a lady, Valerie, who lives near here in a house called Alcheringa. And he stops and he's like, take me there. And so he just gets this feeling he's meant to go there. So they head off to her house. And Valerie, you can imagine, she says she's never interacted with any Aboriginal people. Because though she's lived in Australia her whole life, because of the way the culture is, is quite separated, to be honest. There's a lot of racism, obviously, historical problems. She's never had any interaction. She's now got this ancient relic in her house. And within a few weeks, an Aboriginal elder is knocking on her door. So you can imagine you're in the back of your head thinking, this doesn't feel coincidental, right? So she has this conversation, and she sort of blurts out, I've got this artifact in the room, feels like he knows. And he says, it's men's business, which is true, because you're not supposed to, traditionally only men and only elders would have handled these, that women shouldn't be near them. right? That's just part of the taboo. So, but she has this conversation. She says, well, do you want to take it? Do you want to hold it? And he's like, no. And she said he's visibly kind of scared. And he says, but what I would like, she says about this communication, what she's been having. And he says, well, what I'd like to do is that we go to a site called Carry-On. Now, if you're familiar with the Gosford glyphs, I don't know if you've heard that, the mystery of the Gosford glyphs. They're a controversial site in New South Wales with Egyptian hieroglyphs engraved into 2 rock walls in a canyon, right? And so over the last few years, there's been a lot of controversy of whether these are a hoax or what exactly they are, but they appear to be like a mixture of Proto-Egyptian and other engravings. And I'm not going to whether they're real or not.
Yeah.
But he suggests going there because this is an Aboriginal site. It is a sacred site anyway, irrespective of the glyphs. It's on a rocky outcrop, which is a men's and women's site used for different purposes there. And part of the site has these hieroglyphs in it. So she arranges to go with him. And a few weeks after that, they do this. And whilst there, they describe having this extraordinary time slip event where one moment everything's, kind of normal. She, has this interaction again with the artifacts and voice telling her about some history of alien visitations to this planet, stuff like that. And then afterwards, they're standing looking out towards the bay and they describe having, the paranormal would certainly be called like a time slip, where one moment it seems like they're just in present reality. And then they describe it seems almost like the forest becomes heavier and denser and hotter. And they look down and now they can see that there is what looks like a saucer craft crashed in the water at the beach, and hovering above it, another saucer that is rescuing people from the water. And they start to have a knowing of what this is about. And they realize that they also no longer look entirely human, that they seem to become non-humans. They can see non-humans on the beach, a mixture of different types, and they themselves suddenly realize that they are connected to this event. And the funny thing is, Gerry, years ago, he had a dream where he was on board this strange craft, this white craft, and that there's an emergency, and he flees the craft to an escape craft and then leaves. And he said, very vivid. And now he realized, he says, this is the continuation of this dream he had as a teenager. And now he understands that this is the after effects, that this ship has been destroyed, that the craft in the water, that he was the pilot in a past life, and that he drowned in the craft, pinned to the thing by a piece of metal, and that these other people, he knows who they are in that life. So there's a whole kind of weird past life aspect. Now, I don't know if it's past lives or if it's a transmission of information. You can go down a lot of roads with this. The point is, these kinds of events, normally you can say, okay, very strange. Okay, what do you make of it? There's lots of channeling out there. There's lots of people saying they met aliens who told them stuff. Well, Valerie put together a whole long book that tells not that event, but after that, meeting other people that also seem to remember this event or have sudden memory when they meet her, or when they are near the device, this stone, or when they are given a regression, right? That they remember being part of this story. So it's very, very strange. Okay, I'm going to give you straight away. This is unbelievable on the face of it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the difference with this case is, and why I became involved with it, is that there was so much information in the book, and some of it suggesting events on such a major scale that they should have traces in the geological records and in the genomic records, mm-hmm. right? So if true, this is really an artifact from an alien civilization that was holding the records of a visitation, what we would call a Bracewell Sentinel probe, right? So it was interesting that you can go and look at that. Ronald Bracewell was an engineer that wrote a paper back in 1960 on the idea of Sentinel probes, AI artifacts that could be dispatched to alien worlds to monitor them, mm-hmm. and potentially to make contact on behalf of the civilization. So they'd be autonomous ambassadors of alien civilizations. And he believed that there was probably a network of advanced civilizations out there that could just send these out and to expand their frontiers rather than having to be everywhere themselves. Send these things out, let them sit on planet surfaces or in orbits, monitoring any fledgling civilizations, and that once they reached a certain point, using them to make contact. Now, I have reason to think that that's what we have in this Alcheringa, that the lore itself is of a living artifact that was kept sacred because it could supply information, but it itself was alive and was left here by beings, intelligent beings in the creation time. Now, that law, it may be mythologized, but that is the description of a Sentinel probe, right? So now if the Aboriginal people acquired one of these very early in the timeline, we could certainly see how it would end up as a sacred artifact hidden in a cave, because it would be like the most important thing you ever found, right?
Yeah.
So that thing is really, really special, and it can communicate with you, right? A sentient being in a, small handheld form, right? Almost like our technologies now.
Yeah.
Right. And so amongst those claims, and this is where we get to the key bit, anyone who's not lost by the levels of woo and strangeness, that you get to these major claims in there. And the ones that stand out is, first of all, the claim that an enormous craft, a megastructure, an AI silica megastructure, arrived here around the time that our ancestors came about, and obviously that's part of the story. So hundreds of thousands of years ago. She suggests maybe as far back as 900,000. I mean, I've narrowed it down. I'll get to that. But that basically this enormous craft was here, and that it is destroyed in orbit. And it's described that its molten debris rains down across the planet's surface, right? So that is one major event straight away. And I was thinking, okay, well, that potentially could leave debris that you could find, right? Now, the second thing it describes is a few years later that there is a follow-up mission by associated forces of this craft to enforce the original agreement, which was that a handover of planet Earth to this craft, colonization, by a group that is already embedded here, that is a more negative group. Now that they've had a negotiation, there's supposed to be a handover, it's a betrayal. This ship is destroyed in that action. Now, this second group is more of a militarized wing. And so they say, leave the planet now or face bombardment. And then they initiate a bombardment. But this is not like how we think of bombing. They bring in asteroids and pound underground facilities from space. Now, that's a mega event. Asteroids being flung down, something, well, if that's true, again, that has to be there in the geological records, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other one was the survivors of this original mission realize they cannot colonize Earth. They are dying from radiation, exposure to bacteria, from inability to breathe, because they come here utilizing genetic modification technologies on themselves so that they can inhabit this world and inhabit other worlds. And this is something we're exploring ourselves. NASA's looking at doing this because if you think about it, if you're going to live in other planetary environments that you are poorly suited to, one option is building, facilities that you live within, right? Controlled facilities. The other option is changing yourself so that you can live on those worlds, or changing your offspring so they can live on those worlds. And that is something we are looking at doing now, is splicing tardigrade DNA into astronauts.
That would make more sense, than terraforming a planet.
Right, exactly. It makes more sense. So these are technologies that make sense. But of course, when she had this keep in mind that the events happened in like 1994, although the book's in 2003. So though these make sense to us now, these were almost unthinkable concepts for this lady living in Australia, this sort of new age. So the things it's telling her obviously were very alien and foreign to her, but now to us today, these are actually the stuff we are looking at doing. It's same as vast silica networks, vast AI silica networks. Now we're actually thinking that's probably the future of computing, that you can essentially have no limit on a brain that is a vast silica network. So now you think about an enormous craft composed essentially mostly of silica, that the computer is the entire craft. We are very wasteful, right, with our crafts, because we have a small computer, all this metal enclosing. If the entire ship is the computer, well, you're flying around in a super intelligence that can just help you with any problems. Just calculate that for us. Yeah, no problem. Right. Yeah. So the whole thing is a sentient AI. Right. And then the third thing was that they modified a hominin. So they realized they couldn't survive. They hadn't completed their own modification before the ship was destroyed, that they were partially adapted. They couldn't handle the sunlight. They couldn't breathe properly. They couldn't handle a lot of the bacteria and stuff in the water. They're dying off. The few survivors that made it down are dying off. So they realized that what they can do instead, and again, this is a different kind of mindset, is colonization or inclusion of this planet into their network through modifying the top species here at the time, the early hominin, to make it more like themselves. So rather than them taking the planet by default starts to become more into their domain by changing a species that will be their kind of representative of their way of being and their way of thinking already here and that can live here. So they go about the process of modifying an early hominin and changing it to be more like themselves. And also before they die, taking on board the process of passing on information, training and sculpting this species, essentially what we would now think of as domesticating, right?
Yes.
They domesticate these hominins, okay? So these three things are major, right? They're really massive claims. So when I set out with this, I thought, well, if I could substantiate, say one or two of these, it's worth publicly tackling this and saying that maybe there's something to it. If I couldn't substantiate any of it, there's no point in me burning my career as a kind of researcher and writer on something that just sounds wacky as heck. And that, there's plenty of channelings out there. There's plenty of contact cases. It doesn't need me to add to the mix with another one that doesn't lead to anything, right? Mm-hmm. That's my position. I mean, I've had other stuff I could focus on, like I should have done a follow-up book to Forgotten Exodus, quite honestly. I've got Graham Hancock boosting my work. Everything looks really good. And as he warned me, if you go down the aliens road, you're handing a stick to the opponents to beat you with. Because, they already... right? Because the skeptics are already against even that topic, right? Questioning our early story just as humans. So if you go down the aliens route, that you're gonna have the hornet's nest of skeptics against you, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a difficult decision to do that. But then once I realized that, hang on a minute, we do have supporting evidence for all three of these. Now that was a game changer. Right, because then I realized that looking closer, it turned out that 788,000 years ago, something enormous, silica object, seems to have fragmented in space and rained down material across 20% of the Earth's surface. And this is Australasian Tektites, and they range all the way from basically from Thailand and China all the way down to Antarctica in this enormous debris field. Right. And that there's this mystery. I've never heard of it. The mystery of Australasian Tektites, a persisting mystery for about 200 years.
Could you say what that is exactly? Because I've never heard of that before. So what is that exactly? And how is that found?
Australasian Tektites are a type of glass. So there's 4 or 5 Tektite strewn fields on Earth. Now, to differentiate Tektites from other glasses, right? Essentially, you've got natural glass and artificial glasses, right? So, and also you've got glasses that are fined and homogeneous and glasses that are heterogeneous and unfined. Now, so I'll explain that a bit better. So you've got, if you set off a nuclear bomb, right, you will end up with trinitite, right? You end up with a blast glass. Now, that's an artificial glass because it's done by us doing artificial measures. But that type of glass is very foamy, full of bubbles. It's full of partially melted materials. It's full of, bits of sand, organics, and it's essentially chemically identical to the source material, right? So that's one type of glass. So that's a glass that is formed in a very short-lived high-energy event. Now, in natural glasses, you have a very similar result when you have an asteroid impact. And these, you get impactites. And impactites are very foamy, very frothy, full of part melt. They are almost identical to the crater that they're found in and around. They include organics. Why? Okay, because this is almost identical. It's a short-lived, high-energy event. Mm-hmm. Rapid heating, rapid cooling. Okay? So now, if you go to artificial glass that we use, now that is a homogeneous fined glass, because what you do is you heat it in a crucible over a period of time. Now, I don't know exactly how long we usually do that, but over a period of time, you remove the impurities and the volatile chemicals. You can bubble off stuff you don't want, and you mix the components, and you end up with tableware glass and window glass and stuff, right? Okay. It's a very homogeneous, which means very well mixed. All the chemicals are mixed throughout, right? And also it's fined, and that fining process is the removing of the volatiles and the bubbles. So when you look out your window, there's not really any bubbles in the glass. Right? That's all been dealt with in that process. Now, so that's an artificial glass that's like that. Now, a natural glass that's like that, volcanic glass. Okay, so you find that volcanic glass which forms basically in a caldera, which is a similar kind of situation to the crucible. So you've got long scale heating of the components. So they become very well mixed in there, and they're bubbling off all of the volatiles, and you end up with obsidians, right? And obsidians, again, they look very much like manufactured glass, and chemically are more similar to that. Not identical, but very similar. Now, tektites sit in a kind of a category of their own. Right, so that's why I'm getting this quite important. So it's just people can familiarize themselves with these different kinds of glass, natural, artificial, find, unfind, etc. Why tektites are an anomaly. Tektites resemble obsidians. So they are very well mixed, very homogeneous, very fine, very few bubbles in them. And yet they are proposed to have formed during hypervelocity asteroid impact events. Right?
Interesting.
So there are specific angles that these have formed in that. And so part of the mystery of them is, how do you explain the fining process if they are in the same events that we see normal impactites from? Because those impactites are nothing like that. They are just foamy and frothy, full of bubbles, full of part melt, totally unlike them. So this has been persisting mystery. And there's a few exotic kind of hypotheses of how this can happen. But at present, there's no widely accepted, well-explained mechanism for how you can end up with this homogeneous fine glass from an impact event, right?
Okay.
Because you do need some kind of explanation. Say, well, how are we breaking the rules here? And yet we look at every other crater where we find glass and we know it's from that crater. It's not like that. The Australasian Tektite stream field is even stranger because there is no crater associated with it. Right? The other four, they have found craters that, at least in terms of time, seem to match when they formed. So they say, well, we think something to do with an impact at a certain angle, and that there may be a mechanism that's caused it. But at least they can say maybe it's from that crater. The Australasian Tektite stream field is the biggest and the youngest of these fields. It's only 788,000 years old, and it involves debris covering 20% of the Earth's surface, billions or trillions of tons of debris. This crater should not only be visible, it should be enormous. It should be at least they think probably at least 100 kilometers across, minimum, really. Because if you look at the impact site, say, for if you got to Chesapeake Bay, which is something on that scale, Chesapeake Bay also has a tektite stream associated with it. Chesapeake Bay is about 100 kilometers across. And there's less tektites associated with that event than there is with the Australasian event. So you would expect an even bigger crater. There is no crater. No crater's been found. There's recently someone has suggested a site in Laos where there's an under lava field anomaly, but it's very small. And I've seen there's papers that basically dismiss this on chemical grounds as well as the size. That's not to say there isn't an impact there, but again, it doesn't explain it. Okay. So they're left with this problem. So, well, you've got this enormous stream field, 20% of the Earth's surface covered with this glass, a glass that's in itself mysterious. And then to go even stranger, there's a particular form called button tektites, and they're unique to the Australasian Tektite stream field. And these button tektites are aerodynamically shaped in such a way as it's very clear that they have come in from space.
Oh,
so this material, the argument then has to be that the material went up into space and it's come back down, but it also has to come down along angles that are essentially horizontal to the plane of the Earth. So, and as some NASA guys put this, in other words, like orbital paths. So that these are in orbit, and then they gradually skip along the edge of the atmosphere, and they start to melt at the front edge, and they have gradual melting. Because if anything comes in directly from space, it goes so fast that what you get is evaporation of the top surface layers, and then you get these meteorites. Everyone's seen meteorites, very jagged, rough things. Yeah. They're not shaped aerodynamically because they come in so fast, upper layer melts, and you just got this hot piece of rock. These are shaped to look like the ends of bullets.
Jeez.
Or nose cones. So they've gradually melted, materials run back, and then they have fallen along the southern region of Australia and also parts of Java, nowhere else on the stream field, which again is another problem. because the strewn field is all the way from, I say, China to Antarctica. And yet this form, the tektite buttons, are only in these two parts, Southern Australia and Java. So again, strangeness there. And further to this, in Indochina, where they think ground zero should be for this impact, imaginary impact, you find Muongnong layered tektite, which is another form, which is literally layering of melt glass on the ground. I mean, some of the chunks are like 25 kilos. So, well, like something that size is not going to travel far. So if there was an impact, that would be ground zero. It has to be 25 kilo chunks. Those are not flying into space, or they're not flying far at all. And yet the Muongnong tektites are found in China and all the way to Thailand. So if this is ground zero, that crater would have to be enormous.
Yeah.
Like thousands of miles across. So they know there's something's really not adding up with this picture, right? And so this is, I wrote a paper on this, which if you can look on ResearchGate, under my name, they'll see where I tackle this and say, basically, I'll try and close a picture of it so we get the idea that this, how mysterious this glass is. But so let me very quickly say, why does this point to an anomalous craft in orbit? Well, what this actually looks like is that an object exploded, yes, in the Indochina region, but not at the ground level, like in the air. Because what you've got instead is something breaks up there in an explosive event, and large pieces are propelled in all directions. So some are propelled downwards, and so you get multiple aerial bursts. And there's a guy's work, a US geologist who kind of posits this work, that basically you see the signatures of aerial bursts across that region. And so wherever one of these things comes down, you get plasma storms on a mad scale. That these go off like nuclear bombs, right? And so underneath, they're searing the ground, melting the ground. There's lightning. It's not as hot as the sun. So the ground is being melted and folded in this storm. And so you get a mixing of the parent body. So the object itself is mixing with the rock. And this is what you find in the chemical composition. And that this is happening wherever one of these large pieces breaks the atmosphere. So you've got Muongnong tektites from China all the way across to Thailand. And that is the other thing. So signatures of it, that in at least one instance, he's found samples where you have welding of cooled tektite glass and a splash of molten glass. He said, in other words, several hours later, there has to be a separate high-energy event for that molten glass to splash onto the cool glass. So that can't be a singular event. He says that's like the smoking gun of aerial burst. And we also know today from the Atacama Desert glass, which if people look that up, they have realized that this folded and twisted glass is from a fragmenting comet aerial burst event. So this kind of glass is a signature of aerial bursts. And so in different studies, you're starting to link up. So you realize you've got an object has blown up, but not at the ground level. Mm-hmm. Now, some of those chunks may well have hit the ground. That's why I think in Laos, where they have a crater, it's about, I think it's something like 20 kilometers across. So too small for explaining this stream, but it certainly would fit with one of the larger chunks breaching right down to the ground level.
Gotcha.
Because if you've got lots of these things coming up, one does pound the ground, but the rest of it, we've just got surface melt. Now, if you trace that back down the strewn field across Australia, and this is another thing that the same geologist noted, that you find these tektites often in a cluster. So you might come upon a region where you find hundreds of them. There used to be, most of them collected, hundreds of them in a region, and then not find any for 1,000 miles. So what's going on there? Because this is waves of debris coming out from a singular impact. You should see them almost in ridges, lines. If you imagine the waves coming out, right, you'd see them like that. But instead, they're in like almost circular clusters. Well, that again is signatures of aerial bursts. Explodes and falls down in a circle, right? So you've got the circular debris for each aerial burst spread across Australasia. So, and then at the end of that debris field is the Antarctic microtektites, and they know that these are millimeter across size tektites, and these were the furthest and hottest flung pieces of debris by the chemical composition. They said this was the end of the strewn field. So so you've got this event centered over Indochina. And remember, you've got these other pieces that seem to skip along the atmosphere. They've blown out sideways. You've got bits have gone down, bits have gone up, bits have gone out in all directions from this explosion. So these other bits have skipped along the top of the atmosphere. And so this is the remnants of the orbiting object. So in other words, the NASA studies back in the 60s and 70s, they said, well, this appears to match with the fragmenting of an object, like a natural satellite or something in orbit, coming apart, and the debris is following the decaying orbital paths. And so you can imagine some of it continues on in the existing orbit, and it starts to come down. And so that's where you've got bits breaking atmosphere, you've got the small bits. So you can sort of picture in your head now, so you've got it was coming south through Indochina when it's destroyed. Mega event there. Debris, then pieces are breaking atmosphere over Australia as it's coming down, more pieces. And then the last debris field is in Antarctica. And the wildest thing is that dated to the same time, anomalies in Antarctica suggest that an enormous object broke up into 5 pieces and impacted the ice. And that one of these pieces left a hole about 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. And so that would have punctured down into the rock beneath the ice. And the only thing that prevented this from being a kind of a doomsday cataclysm type event, because this would have been an object that's somewhat on the scale of the dinosaur killer.
Yeah.
Like kilometers across when it broke up. So that it was because we were in an ice age, the sea ice absorbed most of the energy. So all those tsunamis and stuff that would have raced out, they're absorbed by the ice. But it melted a lot of ice and it raised sea levels globally. But it didn't create the same sort of firestorms. It hit the ice field. It didn't create the same level of tsunamis, so it didn't have the same effects as when this happened, during a warm period with the dinosaurs. Absolutely cataclysmic, right? So hang on a minute. So we've got another weird thing going on here at the same time. You're telling me that you've got this enormous silica thing breaking up, silica debris for, 10 to 12,000 kilometers long. And now there's some other thing has gone into the ice at the same time, right? So I'm just kind of thinking, well, that's pretty amazing when I'm then looking for an anomalous object like that's broken up. And what's this stuff made of? Around 75 to 80% silica. And no natural objects in our solar system have more than 60% silica. So asteroids and something don't have more than that. So this object has an unusually high silica composition, right? Also aluminium, tungsten, all sorts of other things in there. But primarily silica. And what am I looking for? A vast silica megastructure, right? So we now have an anomalous event involving a highly silica parent object that appears to be in orbit based on NASA's previous studies of this, that suggests a satellite breaking up in orbit. And then some large chunks of something go into the ice dated to the same period. And that's right at the end of this strewn field. So that's a mind bender in itself.
Yeah.
And then turns out at the same time as this, and this is quite amazing as well, that's the last time that we have a geomagnetic reversal, a complete reversal of the Earth's field.
Wow.
780,000 years ago to 790,000 years ago is when they date the last full reversal. Isn't that funny that that's right at the same time? And then on top of that, that is when the climate cycles destabilize, that we know that it used to be that we had much shorter warm periods. And so this is essential. It's considered essential to the rise of civilization that we get these breaks of at least 10,000, on average, at least 10,000 years of climate where we can adapt, increase in numbers, form civilization. That is essential to us. That also comes about in a sudden change around about 780 to 800,000 years ago. So in the same timing, you've got the geomagnetic reversal, the destabilization of our climate systems, which leads to us being able to have a civilization, almost like a terraforming event. And then on top of that, we have this multi-directional bombardment. Turns out there's not just the impact I talked about, there's impacts in Tasmania, there's an impact in Canada, they think now, also an impact in Central America, in Belize, and possibly another impact in Southeast Asia, all dated to the same time.
Jeez.
Right? And so this study came out in 2016. Remember, these events I'm talking about from 1994, when Valerie got this information, and Gerry Bostock. So I sort of refer to it as the Bostock Barrow case, because they're the main two people. There's other people involved, but they're the main two people. So when they got this information, unheard of, nobody knew there'd been this multi-directional bombardment. And then they didn't mention Australasian Tektites. They didn't know about it. They weren't researchers, just people that had these strange experiences. But so it turns out that, they couldn't have made this story by cherry picking science, right? Because you didn't know that was real at the time. So it turns out that, in 2016, they found that there was these different objects hit. and also that they are not from a singular, I'm not going to let you go, and I'm giving you the whole thing, but that there is this event which is not one object breaking up, because that would be the logical jump, right? You'd think, well, do we have one big object, breaks up, pieces of it come down, hitting different places? No. Turns out the chemical composition from each of the sites is different. These are different objects coming in from different sides, pounding the earth at the same time. What the hell is going on there?
Yeah.
What the hell is going on? Why do we suddenly have that happen? The last time things like that happened was like the late heavy bombardment, when our solar system was full of debris and planets were forming. And, it's really rare for a big object to hit. It's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years apart on average. The idea that, say, 4 or 5 would all just start coming, pounding in from each side is wild in itself. And, you'd say, well, that was spectacularly unlikely, but okay, weird. But then you've got to say, and at the same time, something creates a 12,000 kilometers long glassy debris field, and something scours down at the ice in 5 chunks.
Yeah.
And the climate destabilizes, and the magnetic field collapses. So you're starting to think there's a lot going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the last thing is us. And obviously, this is the big one. So we're being suggested to in this narrative that not only are these aliens responsible for this whole crazy circus that these hominins of the time would have been living through, but are responsible for manipulating these hominins soon after and creating us. And so how can we prove that? We can't actually prove it. Genetics is not so easy to do as with geological data. Tektites are a very fixed thing. Right,
yeah.
You've melted like this way, or they flew that way. You can look at physics, you can look at the chemistry. Obviously, genomics is a little bit more subtle. But what they suggest is that they took some of the hominins that were present in that region, and this is another interesting because, of course, the official dumb view is that there were no hominins in Australia until about now they think maybe 80,000 years ago or so, possibly. But this is obviously hundreds of thousands of years ago. So, that's funny. But if you look again, we now know that in Flores and in island Southeast Asia, hominins are present 1 million years ago, right? They've crossed through Wallace's line, which is the geological barrier between Southeast Asia and Oceania, right? And for a very long time, it was believed that no large mammals or large animals could cross between those continents. Rats and a few things did it on pieces of debris, and but no large mammals were meant to have been able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that's totally wrong, because Homo erectus managed to get to Flores 1 million years ago. How would he do that? Well, most likely with watercraft.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we say watercraft, not like boats with sails, but probably could be a log, could be some bamboo tied together with vines, like a simple basic watercraft, just something you can float on.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can make it, and it's still that's a hard journey. Remember, this is some of the worst oceans to be sailing across. But it does make it, right? We know that there was enough of them made it to make a sustaining colony on Flores. And not only that, we find that 700,000 years ago there are the little people, the Homo floresiensis, living on Flores, and they may or may not be a dwarf version of Homo erectus. They may be an evolution of something like an Australopithecine. Nobody's sure, because we have these two groups of hominins. Again, they're both on the wrong side of Wallace's line. Now, if anyone looks at the map, you'll notice that if you're at Flores, it's a short drop, now to get to Australia. You've got this enormous continent just across the water from you. You've done the hard work. You've crossed Wallace's line. Now you can pretty much be washed across by accident to Australia, right? Because it's just to the south of you, a few miles. It's not far, right? In fact, I think from the mountains at the top of Flores, you should be able to see the coastline of Australia. Are we really going to believe that because we haven't found the bones, that hominins 1 million years ago were on Flores inside of Australia, and none of them made it across for the next 900 and something thousand years?
Yeah.
Right, it's untenable. So what's more likely is that those sites where they landed are under the sea, because we've had 130-meter sea level rise at the end of the ice age. So all of those colonization sites around the coast are under the sea. Well, not unless you do a lot of ocean archaeology, you're not going to find their sites. Also, there's an enormous desert in the middle of Australia that is poorly explored, poorly mapped, and a community of people that are on the whole, quite hostile to Western science because of the history, and are not likely to go, oh, there's a sacred burial site of some ancestors in that mountain. So there's a few different problems of why it's very hard to look for human. And the climate in Australia is terrible for preserving human remains. So you've got a mixture of problems that make it very hard to find early hominins in Australia. It doesn't mean they weren't there. So the funny thing is, these beings, this message is saying that they found hominins locally. They took them, and they said, and then they modify them. And so even that suggestion, if you're going to make something up, why make up that the hominins were in Australia? Why not say that you flew to Africa and got some? Yeah. Right? But they say, no, they're saying there was hominins here and we used them. And so they then begin the process. And again, this is some of the stuff I know this is wild stuff, but there's a lot of logic in here. Again, if you're making something up, it's funny because they say that it doesn't work out at first. They said because all their main technology is destroyed on the main ship, that they said essentially we're trying to create a new species from the medical kits on the crafts. They said that this is all we've got left. So and they in the end they're only successful because some members of the other non-human species that's on the planet turn traitor and help them. And that don't agree with the ambush and don't agree. And they say that these beings have a thorough knowledge of these hominins because they helped to engineer them in the first place.
Well, I want you to keep going, but I just want to make sure I'm following this part. So the theory is, or the story is, that was passed to these people is that there was something here advanced before, and then another ship was coming and they were going to pass it off for whatever reason. Are those details kind of murky?
So there's so two different collectives. There's a negotiation. In my understanding, the Earth was originally part of this other collective, and at some point in history was seized. There's been a negotiation to return it to within this other alliance, with different concessions being made. Mm-hmm. And so they agree this. But then there's a kind of a betrayal that in this mix and destroy this ship. So this essentially is a fairly peaceful colony ship. It's described that basically it's infiltrated, agents on board disable its shields, and it's destroyed.
Okay. And then that's when
there's a bit of espionage, and then, it melts, it rains down.
Okay.
Very few survivors get to small craft. They exit before the main ship blows. Small number come down in Gosford at that site we talked about, and that they establish a kind of a base in Australia. And so there's very few. So there is this backstory. But you got to remember, there's another group on the planet still. A high-tech civilization is here, and that they are actively hunting down, looking for any survivors. They're also recovering. Part of why they've done this, they've also been seizing technologies that were already brought down from the mothership, that they see that they have the potential for acquisition of their opponents' technologies, as well as genetic samples, but they want bodies as well. They want the bodies of the people, and they want their technology, because all of this is useful to their group.
Okay.
So they're out looking for this. So they waited till a lot of the technology was transferred to sites on the planet's surface, destroyed the ship, and then harvest the technologies.
Which side was doing, from the ship was doing the survivors, or were they doing the manipulations of the genetics of what the primates here or whatever was existing already?
Right. Yeah. So they're utilizing what's left of their technologies to change this group that's already been manipulated by the group that's here already. Okay. They've created the first hominins themselves from a primate species in the past. So this other group has a very intimate knowledge of the genetics. And so a couple of them actually turn sides, and this is what it says. So they help with this project and give them invaluable knowledge on how to work with the genome of these early hominins. And so they're able to then, after a while, come up with successful new variants. But first, some of them are like throwbacks. They come out like apes and stuff, and they die and quite horrible. And again, why include that kind of detail? Because that's kind of funny, because that's kind of what you would expect, that they're experimenting with limited technology. And they say, actually, some of it's horrific failures, and that, it's kind of horrible to see what comes out at first.
Oh, yeah.
But then they gradually come up with successful splicing, and that they change this genome so that you end up with this, what will be the ancestors of Homo sapiens. So a larger brain, less hair, as the characters we have, so compared to what was there already. Mm-hmm. So we have this narrative of that they've transformed some of these early hominins. Now, again, that's wild, because of course that's like us. If that's real, it's totally wild. But to explore whether that's true, you need to then look at what anomalies exist in the genome of humans, and what, if anything, takes us back to that time. Because we can't cherry pick. Again, I don't want to be in a position where you've got to say, well, there's some weird stuff that happened 500,000 years ago, but maybe it was closer to 800,
Yeah.
It'd have to align in time and space, right? So you've got these other events, they all date to around the same period, around 790,000 years ago, this bombardment, these magnetic shifts, this tektite, all of that is locked in time. Okay. So if that's when this happened, then we should see something profound in the human genome that also dates to around that time. Okay, it has to be around that time. And so when you start to look, the amazing thing is, again, if you would try to say this in 2003 or even 1994 or 2003, it was wild, because the understanding was Homo sapiens diverged from Neanderthals around about 400,000 years ago, and that a bit before that, maybe 500,000 years ago or so, 600,000 years ago, that they had this shared ancestor that split and leads to all the large-brained hominins, right? But now, many years later, in fact, in the last few years, that story has changed radically, mainly because we discovered Denisovans, and also because we acquired Denisovan DNA, we acquired more and more Neanderthal DNA, and some, the oldest hominin DNA, 540,000-year-old DNA samples from the cave of bones, the Cuevas de los Huesos in Spain. So that DNA changed our understanding of when Neanderthals arose. We realized actually it was much further back. And also with the Denisovan DNA, we found that split was much further back. And it turns out that the shared ancestor, what we think of ancestor X, is living around about 750 to 800,000 years ago, with a preference for around about 770,000 years ago, approximately. That's when the split begins between all of these large-brained hominins, right? So that's wild, because now you're saying, hang on a minute, at the right time of when they're saying all these different experiments being done that would be producing these different large-brained hominins, that's now where the genomic data is telling us ancestor X was living. This unknown ancestor, we can't find the ancestor X. We just know that it existed. It's probably something on the lines of a Homo erectus. Nobody really knows, but we know that it's undergoing a divergence event at that time. And then it leads to later, there's another divergence where Denisovans, Neanderthals, who are closer to each other than we are to them, that they then split as well. But essentially, the main split between our most direct ancestors and them is occurring in that period, right? So that is profound for this. And again, that's only been known in the last sort of 5 years or so that we've changed that timing. Really, that it's shifted to that period. And on top of that, I mean, there's other like protein data so that also supports this. But this has got wilder and wilder because tackling my work. I don't know if you saw recently, there was a project called the Zoonomia Project. It's a big data project that looking at the genomes of a whole range of mammals, like a couple of hundred mammal species, right? And so you can utilize that data to contrast against the human genome. This is really about big data, AI data. They use these what they call learning neural networks and stuff in AI. So you can basically start to now handle the kind of volumes of data you'd want to contrast species genomes. So this is something that's really like profound and really allows them to kind of say, what makes us different? Right? And we've known for a long time some of the things like chromosome 2 fusion event, that we have 2 ancestral primate chromosomes that fuse end to end. And so we have 46 chromosomes, all other primates have 48. We know that's one of the things that made us different, the implications of that changed us from the other primates. But we knew that we had what's called human accelerated regions, because these were discovered about maybe 15 years ago. So they realized that there's areas of non-coding DNA, so what used to be called junk DNA. There's non-coding DNA that has changed in profound, unexpected ways. So material that should have been, basically highly conserved DNA is DNA that is almost unchanged over tens or hundreds of millions of years, because it has such profound purposes that mutations normally result in the death of the organism.
Okay.
Right? Doing something so it's almost like saying you won't have any lungs. Good luck with that. Right. So, and these are the same across all the mammals we look at. So these regions are very stable, very slight differences. Now, I'll try and boil down a little bit more. So the first one, human accelerated region 1, a short region of DNA, 118 letters long. Okay. Now, they compared it in chickens, chimpanzees, and humans. So contrast it. And between the chicken and the chimpanzee, there has been 300 million years of separate evolution. So that's a lot of time. And what they found was that 2 of those letters had changed. So 2 successful mutations in 300 million years. So 1 every 150 million years works out. That's your mutation rate, okay? Now, they compared that same segment between the chimps and the humans, where we should have had maybe 7 million years of separate evolution. Expectation should be no change. What they found instead was 18 letters had changed.
Jeez.
Right, so that's wild. That's why we call these human accelerated regions, where evolution has somehow super accelerated in regions where it should be incredibly stable. And what they found in the Zoonomia project is that we have hundreds of these, and that they are over 50% are connected to the brain and the formation of the human brain in fetal development stages. Like
Jeez.
When we're being told in this story, they were working on the fetuses and changing them to give us this new brain and give us new anatomy. And now we're finding there's these profoundly changed regions, which are basically, they are switches for expression. So they control the expression of your genes. They're not genes, but they control how your genes turn off or on, or express stronger or weaker. And you can almost like play us like music to make changes into something else. You don't need to be like aliens having sex with humans and all these kind of stories. No, if you can get into that code and you know what you're doing, you could basically turn us into another creature, right? And that is what they're kind of doing. I don't know if you've ever heard that quote from Elon Musk when he says, you know, if you really know what you do with RNA, you can turn a person into a freaking butterfly.
Yeah.
But it's on that level, right? And that's why you don't find Ancestor X, because it's what we're doing with the, I won't jump around too much, but you know what they're doing with the chicken eggs, where they say they can make a dinosaur-like creature born from a chicken egg, right? So if you were to see that dinosaur-like creature and you went looking around for its parents in the record, you won't find it because its parent is a chicken.
Okay.
Right? So Ancestor X, you cannot find Ancestor X because there is no Ancestor X. Ancestor X is the experiment itself.
Oh.
There is no parent that will look like it. So that's the problem. So you can seek this Ancestor X everywhere, and they've looked. No one can find it. And that's because this week's about these the gaps. This is one of the profound gaps in our story, is that it just seems that there is this missing in between, say, Homo erectus and these other primitive hominins and our first ancestor, and with these massive changes. And now we know that these changes, now they were known in the archaeological record from the bones, because we can see there was an accelerated cranial capacity, goes into overdrive around 780 to 800,000 years ago. You can see it in the fossil record. Anyone can look this up at the chart, and it's just like a with our cranial capacity size. Right? So they knew there was an anomaly. But of course, until we had genomics, nobody really knew what was going on there. Now we know that there's a whole slew of strange changes associated with the brain that are going on at that time. And on top of that, we found now what's called H-condyles. These are human conserved deletions. So as well as accelerations, huge chunks of the genome have been deleted, again, from these highly conserved regions. And so they're like, we'd expect them to be a problem, like deleterious. These shouldn't be beneficial. Instead, they seem to be helping the brain form. The very recent one, I don't know if you saw this, was a couple of months ago. It came out that they said a singular event caused the refolding of the genome, the human genome. Now, this is, again, associated with this. What they have found is that, so not only did you have all this stuff going on, but there is a profound change in the 3D structuring of the genome. And they think that what happened is somehow a profound mutation occurred in a single generation. So this is not accumulated mutation over time. In a single generation, so probably either in a single sperm or in a single egg, or in a single fetus, that totally reconfigured the 3D folding. And so this positions different of these accelerated regions against each other. They said this may have acted to change the switches so that they cause different genes to switch on, off, and basically reconfigures how he works. No idea how that happened. No idea. Got to the point now where it's a single event in a single generation, profoundly creates us, and it seems to be that this is occurring just before the split of all these hominins.
So yeah, how is science approaching this? Because I feel like someone like you is more rare, correct me if I'm wrong, where you're looking at all possibilities, no matter how outlandish they may seem at face value. Whereas I feel like traditional science might be like, no, we're not even going to go there. We're going to exhaust or continue to pound our head against a rock, even if it's not working. Is that the approach to this? Are they still like, they're not even entertaining this whole other side that kind of you're exploring?
There's a few scientists that are collaborating now with me because they also feel that this is pointing so squarely to something strange having happened. So, for instance, one's a neuroscientist, another one is a biologist, and I've got geologists and stuff. So there are people that see this. They say, it's like I said, how do we explain this level of profound change in a single generation that is so beneficial to us, that gives us our brain, this brain that has been unique in our species to give us the ability to build spaceships. And it comes out of not a slow accumulation of changes, but now we're down to it being an overnight bloody thing, and that is obviously by work it's been predicting for years, is that this should be a singular event, right? If I'm right, it won't be an accumulation of changes over thousands of years. Yes, as well, later, because once you start that process, changes will accumulate. But you should see a radical change right at the beginning of the split. And so now that is what we're seeing. And we know that Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us all had those changes and all had the chromosome 2 fusion, but no other primates that we know. We don't think any of the other hominins had it. As far as we can tell, and it has to occur not too long before the split. And although we haven't narrowed down the date on this 3D folding stuff, but I reached out to the team because I'd seen in an article saying that maybe it was about 1 million years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, well, if it was 1 million years ago, that's a problem for me because, that's too early. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to see whether or not that they were quite certain of that. And they said actually that was not from their work. They actually, all they can say is it has to have happened before the split with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So that's all they can say at this point. Mm. So in other words, that date was spurious and from the journalists that wrote the article. So I assume they inferred it by the fact that around 1 million years ago, we start to change or something like that. But in reality, we know that that's actually much closer to 800,000 years ago.
Okay.
Right? So they haven't done that. They do want to do some dating at some point, they said, but that wasn't the focus. Okay. So that was kind of interesting. In other words, as it stands, there is nothing countering this having happened exactly then. But you're quite right that, for the most of academia, they do not want to touch this, even think about it, because instead what you can do is you use what I would call almost like time of the gaps, because they have God of the gaps, and aliens of the gaps. Mm-hmm. That people, they say, well, you're just inferring that because we don't know what it is, therefore aliens, or with creationists, therefore God. But their argument is, well, therefore we need more time. In more time, we will find another answer that is acceptable. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So they have time of the gaps. Whereas instead of saying that we don't know, and this looks super weird, and, maybe we need to go into some other thinking here for what we're seeing, they would just say, maybe we need to wait, and maybe in 50 years, we'll have an answer that's acceptable. So why should we go to aliens? Why should we consider that even as being a possibility, right? So that is a priori rejected, not because it isn't scientific. How can it not be scientific that someone else with genomic technologies created, changes in us? Because it's scientific. We do it. It's a scientific process. But it's an unacceptable one because then you're bringing in the whole problem of aliens, which is a massive taboo throughout all of the sciences, right? And again, I don't want to drag us on too far, but consider what happened with the discovery of life on Mars. I mean, when back in the Viking program, and they discovered what seemed like direct evidence of simple life on Mars, mm-hmm. they were kind of horrified. And there's a guy who wrote a really good article on this. And he read through the notes of the Viking mission, And he said, and when it got to the bit where the experiments came up positive, he said, instead of it being like exciting, he said there was a sense of fear in the notes. Right? And then when the last experiment failed, there was a sense of relief. You can think about that.
Yeah.
A sense of relief. It was a problem to find aliens. They didn't want him to do. That's not why we were there. We were there for chemistry and geology, and we didn't even want this damned life experiment to go there. It was an afterthought. And now it's come up with bloody life. So there's something's very wrong, right?
Yeah.
In the very foundations of our sciences, this an a priori rejection of alien life of any sort.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I know because we talked about aliens being real and the power of government being fearful that they would lose some status there. And with the scientific community, when it's proposed to be, especially by a lot of celebrity scientists, when you see them talking like we're open to all possibilities, but you can clearly see that they're not when they're talking about stuff. What is that fear there? Is it also a status thing?
It has to be institutionalized in there. I mean, it's got to be from the top level, that somewhere in there is, an almost even a spoken or unspoken thing that it's absurd, that, aliens are absurd. That's it. And that, that anyone that you would have to know on some level, it's not okay. Because if you look at the work of Professor Milton Wainwright, or Dr. Milton Wainwright, who's a UK-based astrobiologist, he was discovering what seems to be simple life coming in from our atmosphere. And his detector even caught a small metallic sphere made of very hard alloys that split when it came in. So the speed, it left a crater and there was organic goo coming out of it, right? She said, this is either a life form or an artificial seed of life dispatched into space. So he reached out, he put a paper out and everything, but he reached out to NASA, he reached out to other bodies, he said he got no reply. He asked them to repeat the experiment. No interest, totally no answer. Right.
Crazy.
So, and he said the funny thing is when he first went into his career, because he collaborates with Professor Vikram Singh, who's really the main man for panspermia. Okay. He said, so when he first encountered that, and he said, oh, well, there's this whole theory of panspermia, life from space. How exciting, as a microbiologist. And so he thought, people must be knocking his door down to work with him, wow, alien life. And so, and he said, and then he realized as he looked more into it, nobody wanted to work with this topic. He said they were all scared of it. He said that they feared you would lose funding, that you would have a loss of face, that you would destroy your career. And he said that nobody wanted anything to do with it. So this is institutionalized for some reason, that this is either unspoken or inferred, that you do not do work that is about aliens being in our solar system in any serious way, whether it's maybe changing a bit now, but whether it was microbes, whether it's panspermia, whether it's actual, you can imagine actual aliens landing. No, there is some reason that we don't see. Now, that could be, again, to do with a hidden hand in the hierarchy that just doesn't want that door to open at all, because it heads down into this story of, well, what about higher life forms? If simple life exists, do other aliens exist? Did they ever evolve into higher life forms? Has higher life forms ever been in our solar system? So it's certainly possible that is being put in place in that hierarchy for that reason. And that would make sense. I mean, I can't see really why else, kind of from a scientific point of view, it should be the most exciting topic you can possibly get involved with, right? Yeah. So the idea that there's all this fear around it and that people's careers were destroyed. I mean, the two people that did the Viking Lander stuff, their careers were kind of ruined. They would get laughed at, told to shut up and get out of conferences and stuff, like, shut up and sit down with your rubbish, right? They were just serious scientists. They made the amazing discovery. And to the dying days, they both said that detector worked perfectly and had found life to their dying days, right? So something's horribly wrong here, that you've got people like that, people like Wainwright and Wickham Singh, distinguished people. So not, just me saying it's fine. You can say, okay, Bruce, who are you? IT qualification, cranky, blah, blah. Fine. But it doesn't seem to be a problem limited to me. It seems that we have really a problem throughout the entire topic. And even when we can square and I can say, okay, we're not talking about Anunnaki, we're not talking about, plates, I'm reading ancient tablets and trying to reinterpret them. But when we see problems in the genome, things that are so extraordinary that we're now stumped. The best minds are stumped. Yeah. There's no reason why overnight there should be, three-dimensional refolding of the genome that rewrites how the brain develops. There's no reason why huge swathes of the genome should be deleted and it be beneficial to us, right? Or that areas that were super stable in all the other mammals suddenly accelerate. There's no basis for this.
So the odds of these type of things happening that you're talking about, are they just infinitesimally small? Is there a way to quantify that?
There is actually, because Pollard, who first discovered HARs, was a biostatistician who wrote software to do precisely those kinds of things. And so her software crunched it out as being essentially zero. So that basically, that by any understood evolutionary mechanisms, the chances of HAR1 going through the level of change we see is essentially zero.
Jeez. Right?
So their own stats show that. And that was at the beginning of this. Now we're finding all this other stuff, right? This folding and the deletions of the, deletions of conserved DNA.
So you can't put it on like some kind of environmental factor, because more mammals, more closely related things would have the same changes versus something went like inside and did something to us.
Right. Because we don't see that this is being pressed onto other primates even, right?
Okay.
Or to any other animals. We don't see this radical rewriting of their super stable, non-coding DNA. We don't see it happening to these other animals, to all these other mammals that we're looking at. And also, again, this is happening, it seems in a concentrated period. Because with the chromosome 2 fusion, although dating is not 100% on this, the dating that I've seen by British biologist, when he wanted to pin it down, because they knew it had to have happened before the split with Denisovans and Neanderthals, because they have the fusion, right? So the question was, did it happen around then or further back, like, when we split from other primates, right? 7 million years ago. So he did an analysis based on the chemistry and when the telomeres, so the telomeres that preserve the ends of the DNA molecules, so protective sheaths kind of material. So when they fuse, obviously those telomeres, which usually are the fastest evolving areas because they're exposed. So when they fused and became a center of a chromosome, the rate of evolution of changes, of the mutations changes. So again, I'm not quite at his level, but so he explains this and basically that, in other words, he can pin down approximately when that happened. So when that happens, when this stopping of the changes on that telomere kind of happened versus the other ones. So, and he pinned it down and said it appears to be close to 750,000 years ago. Often you hear the idea of humans being upgraded. And so that is somewhat true, but there's also problems. And this fits again with the idea of this being done in an imperfect setting. So if you imagine you've got beings with extraordinary knowledge, but they've got a limited technological capacity. So they're saying they're not doing this to perfection. Now, the funny thing about that is look at the genomic errors that we have. Look at the genetic diseases that we have. Many of them are unique to humans. And in fact, many of the problems we have are not seen in other primates. And indeed, many of our reproductive problems in particular are unknown in the primate family, right? And that's kind of funny because the central driving purpose, if you like, of an organism is successful reproduction. Mm-hmm. Humans, we have a slew of bizarre reproductive issues, not least, hidden female ovulation timing, but also the number of spontaneously aborted fetuses, which is a huge, like you probably know, a huge percentage of pregnancies end in spontaneous abortion. Also that the pregnancy, very dangerous, and so is the birth, that you have all sorts of dangers in that are not seen in primates who have easy births, easy pregnancies, visible ovulation, do not have all these chromosomal errors and fetal abortions because of mutations. But why would that be? Because you say, well, if nature, evolution is a natural process, one of the things it primarily does is sweep away problems, particularly reproductive problems. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because everything's gearing up for you to reproduce. So if there is a group of organisms that have severe reproductive problems out of a larger population, they should go, right? They should fail to be the main group. Mm-hmm. Instead, we have a complete replacement. All hominins today are, basically are us, with the same number of chromosomes and with all these changes and with these problems. And the reason why is because the benefits we got from these changes are so extraordinary that they've allowed us to take over the planet effectively, outcompete all the other hominins, Homo erectus, everybody else was here, gone, outcompeted or bred into us. They're all done, right? So why couldn't we get rid of these problems then? Well, because the same areas of the genome that gave us those benefits are tied to the problems. So they cannot be swept away by evolution without removing the benefits, the brain and the other things that we've got. They're all tied from those same changes. So when this was done, it was imperfect work. And that imperfect work has left us with a legacy of suffering as well as success. And that is the thing, right? Evolution its hands are tied. It can't fix us. And the ironic thing is, the only thing that can fix us is genetic engineering.
That's fascinating.
As we into this revolution, we have to fix ourselves, or those that did it. But there's no way for evolution to help us as a species. Not for all these problems that we've got. They're tied into those same regions.
So that makes an interesting question for myself. Is like, what happened supposedly to these things that manipulated us? Are those the things that are depicted in cave drawings and ancient texts and stuff? Are those what you kind of see as the early, I guess, manipulators of our DNA? And are they still around? Did they die off? Like, how did the story evolve from there?
Well, I mean, according to this initial transmission that this comes from, that led to this, and bear in mind, again, that assuming that this is a representative of this collective, they think that, it seems to suggest that they're still around, that they essentially are interested in us still, monitoring us still. And that they also, it's quite clear that this other group that had the planet is still here. He says they're not all wiped out in the bombardment. Says, some of them are still there. And so that's the other thing, because then you get to that kind of this other areas of UFO mythology, aliens mythology, that there's a kind of war going on. And that we're in the middle of something like a cosmic Cold War. And that this planet, although we consider it to be ours, there's others who have a different view on it. And that they've been here longer than us. And that so we may well be the main visible presence, but they wouldn't necessarily agree that it's our planet. And so you have two groups that are kind of opposed. And this would fit with some of the legends, things like the Watchers, the idea that there are intelligences that are kind of standoffish, that are watching what we're doing, and they're also taking interest in what we're doing and which direction we're going. And sometimes are subtly manipulating the direction of our culture, of our civilization, and possibly tweaking the genome intermittently to change what we are like. And there's some funny changes that occur, particularly 70,000 years ago with the rise of behaviorally and anatomically modern humans. There's a change in the frontal cortex that gives us the ability to have the structured languages and the art styles, figurative and representative art that emerges around 70,000 years ago. That is at the same time as we have this, we acquire the ability for language and for describing events and things in places and time that are disconnected. So, you and I take it for granted that we arranged this interview, days before, and that we'd be at our desks. And so it doesn't seem like a big deal, but we don't believe any other animals can do that they can actually cognize the idea of, I will meet you at that rock next Wednesday, and we will do this thing there. And so that is something we can do, that we can have these concepts of place and space and time. And that's to do with this change that occurred in the brain. Now, why is it weird that we had that change in the brain in that way and that gave us that? Well, because it turns out that the only way to acquire that kind of thinking is to be exposed to it up to between birth and 5 years old. That you need to be exposed to it. Otherwise, that part of the brain will never fully activate, and you can never acquire totally that language. Like you get feral children, so they can never be fully recovered if they are not given language and thinking that we have before and after 5 years old. That those children, if you look into it, they never recover.
I think I've seen.
So if you're raised by chimps or something, and then they find you at 10, you never become a fully normal human being. And so this is a problem, because if you think about it, if this is a natural mutation and it should have occurred only in one individual, who the hell is providing the framework for this thinking? Who's there teaching that child this type of language and thinking? Because no one else supposedly has it. They've never had it. They don't even have the brain function for it. And yet it's agreed that you have to be exposed to it. You have to be living it with other people. And so it's a hard problem. And it seems to be essential to how we got language and language and art. So again, it looks like intermittently some very strange things are going on in our genome that have these real hard barriers that, you need a brain change, and you also need someone to teach you. Well, it sounds a bit like someone's come back. You know what I mean? So when you look at stuff like that, it's, again, I get that it's so sci-fi-ish and Prometheus and, so it has an inherent distaste for people in a way, and it's very sci-fi. But at the same time, as you can probably appreciate, which you look directly head on at the problems, if we didn't have a taboo around the idea of other civilizations, you would immediately put that on the table as one of the possibilities. If you had no taboo in our society around the existence of intelligent beings, you would just matter-of-factly say, well, we've got to consider aliens. We've got to consider, lost civilization doing this. We've got to consider natural events and how that would work. But you could put those easily on the same table if we were not a civilization that a priori considers that taboo. Mm-hmm. There's no reason. We know it's a giant cosmos. Most people accept that there's life in the cosmos. Most people accept that there's intelligent life in the cosmos. Where it becomes a problem is that if it's come here, right? So there's nothing about science. It's about a taboo. And we know that there's been enough time for aliens to be here. And this is actually the basis of the Fermi Paradox, right? The basis is there's been enough time for advanced aliens to have come here. So why haven't they? If they exist, why haven't they come here in the past? Why don't we see some indications over the last 4 billion years that one of these civilizations expanded through here and left some traces, right? So that was expected. So because that wasn't found, became the paradox. You say, it was a paradox. So there must be no aliens then, or they're so far away that they haven't reached us yet. But it should only take 100 million years, I think they calculate, for the entire Milky Way to be populated by probes and reconnaissance vessels if there's an expanding civilization. Mm-hmm. We've had over 4 billion years. And the other thing is that Earth has been visible through its oxygen signature for 2 billion years, right? That's enough time for any other civilization that has the ability to travel through space to send probes to Earth or to send, robotic ships or whatever. 2 billion years. So anywhere in the Milky Way that had a technological civilization, anywhere that could detect that oxygen signature in their telescopes, could see that we're an interesting planet just from that, because we haven't found any oxygen signatures. So we know that they're a good indicator of likely biospheres. Forget about whether there's advanced life, doesn't matter. What is interesting, because it looks like there's a biosphere, and we haven't found any biospheres, right? So we have this kind of, again, there's a false argument in the sciences that why would aliens come here? Why would they come? It's not exciting. There's nothing, why do they want to see humans? We look out into space and we see barren rocks and balls of gas, right? We don't find biospheres. We haven't found any indications of life at all. We are interesting. Any planet with a biosphere is interesting. It's an absurd argument that we aren't, based on everything that we've seen. So any civilization out there that detected us had 2 billion years to send a probe. We could have them jam-packed throughout the asteroid belt watching it. By this point, we could have probes from a dozen civilizations here. And on top of that, now, with interstellar objects being detected, we've realized we've been missing a whole category of objects that could include the damn probes, right? Because if we didn't know that there was interstellar objects until a few years ago, right, with Oumuamua, and now we've realized that there should be around 7 per year. We've already found another 3, right? That there should be about 7 per year going through the inner solar system. Factor that back, 4.5 billion years. How many interstellar objects have passed through?
Yeah.
Right? How many of those could have been probed? So we've missed a whole category, billions of objects coming from other solar systems. No reason to discount that a large percent might have been artificial. And this is where, I know I'm getting quite a lecture for your audience, but very quickly, that Avi Loeb points out, either something is drastically wrong with our understanding of solar system formation and the way that objects are thrown out of other solar systems, or we have a lot of artificial objects moving between solar systems. Because to explain the number of interstellar objects that we're now calculating and that we're finding, it rewrites the number that must be thrown out of other solar. Think of the vast cosmic distances. What's the chances that all these interstellar objects are just turning up here if there's only a few out there?
Yeah.
Right? So in other words, there must be gazillions of them, right? And are they natural then? Because if solar systems aren't throwing out as much stuff, like we have, most of our stuff is locked to the sun, right? Mm-hmm. So we're not supposed to be throwing out a lot of material into cosmic space. That's the current model. So like he said, either that model is wildly wrong and solar systems are throwing out loads and loads of material, so much that we've got 7 interstellar objects a year in the inner solar system, or a significant percentage are artificial, and we've been missing all of them. So again, this paradox is not looking so paradoxical. We didn't have the technology, or, well, combined with, we weren't looking properly.
Yeah.
We know we've been missing them. So now this goes back to the thing that we've almost certainly missed: visitations from the past, probably lots with probes and sentinels and nanoprobes, which would be undetectable.
Yeah.
Right? Think about, because these ideas where they have to be giant. Yeah, it's very convenient. I think that we can detect what I'm talking about here as a very large object. But we think about it logically. We're trying to do like micro probes and like little box probes. Factor that down. At some point you're going to be sending nanoswarms. You just look like cosmic dust. You wouldn't see the aliens. You wouldn't know you were looking at them. It could just be a swarm of dust passing through your solar system. And that is a hive-minded AI nanobot swarm exploring your solar system. But stuff like that. But we're just starting to understand the kind of things we probably haven't seen. And maybe can't even detect yet, right? So the idea that we've looked so hard and that no aliens have been here is absurd. We could have, and again, very quick as well, that he pointed out as well that he asked a colleague, like, why don't we, ping radar off of objects in the asteroid belt and see if any are unusual and maybe artificial? They said, why would you bother? We know there aren't any.
It's like, what?
That's what we're living with. So there's a lot wrong. There's a lot wrong with our paradigm.
That's very discouraging when you kind of frame it that way, because you're right. Like if you just take our current technology and you advance that millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years or whatever, it's only going to get more and more insane, and nanobots, like everything you talked about. And it's like, how would we know? I mean, we're just getting to that level now where we kind of understand what maybe is possible. So when you look at it that way, it's kind of depressing. It makes you feel like we won't know the answer,
No, and that's why I think, we have to be able to look at these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. At least so the saying goes. Now, in the case that I'm dealing with, it's an extraordinary claim. I'll give you that. If we're going to judge it by what's considered mundane or extraordinary, and obviously that's in the eye of the beholder, but culturally, it's an extraordinary claim to say that a giant craft came here, aliens modified the genome and stuff. But the evidence is extraordinary. Mm. That's the key point people have to get their head around. A refolding of the genome, deletions of highly extraordinary. Nobody understands it. It's like, ooh, this is bonkers. Overnight changes, not accumulate. Bonkers. Giant object throwing 1 trillion tons of glass across 20%. This is extraordinary stuff. Our whole climate cycle was disrupted. The Earth's magnetic fields changed. Multi-directional asteroids hitting us. New kind of hominins, right? All happening at the same time. So it's like, Bruce, your claims are extraordinary. Well, look at the evidence. It's bloody extraordinary. And, so I'm happy with the idea. I know that a lot of people could just a priori reject it because it sounds like sci-fi. But what do we think it would look like? Right? What would a visitation in the past look like? If it's not going to look kind of wild, right, then how would we even see it? I mean, we're only going to detect aliens by finding something wild, something inexplicable. There's like a persisting anomaly that doesn't go away, that in the end, can't be explained by the understood mechanisms we have. And it persists on, and it leads to us having to consider extraordinary possibilities. And right now, we have a very brief period of time in which we have a cluster of extraordinary events. And now, when you fit them with the extraordinary claims which are associated with an artifact which fits the predictions by leading thinkers that aliens would probably send small compact AI probes here that could make contact with us. And that seems to be precisely what we have. And it's in the cultural lore of the Aboriginal people. I didn't come up with that story. They are saying they had these things from the dream time left by these creation beings that were living compact artifacts that could communicate, right? That's in their lore. And that now it turns out one of these artifacts, it seems, had an encounter with an Aboriginal elder and we're this, European origin person, but had an encounter with these people. And it did precisely what Bracewell and these others predicted, that it opened contact and knew our history, which is another thing they've said, these things would probably know our whole history and could return it to us. And that's what it does. So the frustrating thing is this is hand in glove fit to what our leading thinkers expect: giant AI silica objects, small AI probes, contacts through AI, potential for very old visitations should be in the record. All of that, it's all what we expect. But when it's real, it's a problem, because even for me, sometimes I think, it can't be real, like real, right? Because it's strange. You know what I mean? I'm sure you can understand, because you must feel that too. It's got that side to it where we can believe very abstract things, that are possible. But I think when they manifest, it's very different. Like the idea that aliens might be up there in UFOs, it's kind of far away still, right? So we see these things and maybe they're aliens, we can believe it, and people say they've seen aliens, but it's all a little bit intangible. So you're left being able to say, but yeah, maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not. But when you start to have physical pieces of something in your hand that's anomalous, and you're looking at a genome full of anomalies, and there's this intelligence apparently that's contacted us telling this story years before we knew this stuff, we have a very different situation. And so that's why no matter how strange people, the first part of my work, feel it, how strange it is, when you get to the full picture, it's very hard, I think, to a priori reject the possibility that this is contact, that they have given us the first stage of contact, where they basically, and this is why I'm going to explain to someone else, is that what you should be given, and again, if this is for channeling or anything like that, to check if you're dealing with a real, distinct entity and intelligence, is you should be able to test it by requesting it gives you legitimate knowledge that was unknown to you beforehand and that can be validated objectively. Because that's the only way to know you're talking to a legitimate real entity with knowledge you don't have. And that is the basic test, whether you're doing mediumship, channeling, or talking to aliens. They should be able to do that.
I wanted to ask you that. It's a weird crossover between paranormal, some of these phenomena, and then you have like the alien thing, and then you have like the religious part of it and the stories and the symbolism, which is oddly like when you were talking about a good and a bad kind of war between us. I mean, it's very similar to like religious teachings. How do you go through all that? Because that does start to get even more out there, and then you might get a bunch of more eye rolls, like, oh, now he's looping in. I mean, people try to do that. You see it all the time on UFO Twitter. Like they'll go, oh, this person believes in ghosts, so therefore they're crazy, and you cannot believe anything they say about aliens. How are you navigating all this, and do you buy into these connections that seem to be between these things?
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think that we have to, again, another problem with this entire case or this case study is that it involves what sounds like psychic phenomena, right? And psychic phenomena, again, is a cultural problem for Western materialist scientists, right? But there is no telepathy, there is no, psychic phenomena. This isn't, except for a very small subset of scientists, like ions and people that are looking at this. At the most, they straight reject that. So they can't even get to the bit of an entity telling you something. Oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
The woo, the woo is here.
Yeah.
But yeah, the irony is in labs today, voice to skull technologies are being tested, using through microwaves, sonic emissions, AI reading your brain, telling you what you're thinking. We are in that process of creating technologies that can interact directly with the human brain. Right. So it doesn't need it to be, like we say, the magic of consciousness or paranormal. Even if we just take this as technological, that there is no particular reason to think that an advanced, highly, highly advanced emissary from an extraterrestrial civilization wouldn't include the capabilities for brain access, transfer of information. Because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you assume that maybe that species would be hard to communicate with? Let's make sure that we send something that can do direct to brain communication. The best way. What do you want to have flashing lights and sign language? How is it going to communicate with them? Like, just to say, if you a class of artifacts you're going to send out to lots of civilizations, if you can include in it a way of it directly interfacing with the neurology or nervous system, whatever of those beings, well, that's definitely going to be on your list, isn't it? Of how do you interact with aliens?
Yeah.
Direct, so we know that we're creating those technologies. So I don't think we even need to open that. We don't need to open that door of it being the kind of consciousness, allowing psychic communication or even like quantum theory. I think we can just say that even on the level of technology that fits. Now, I don't think it necessarily is just technology. It is to do consciousness and legitimate psychic phenomena, which I do accept the reality of because of my own experiences and the collation of data by IONS and other organizations suggesting that humans on the whole have some weak level of psi and that some people are far above average. The average is weak, but there's going to be, of course, in the average, there's people who actually show negative side, people that unexpectedly have a very low level of intuition to the point where it's actually, it's weird that they get it wrong that much. And then there's, to the other side, people, it's weird how they get the things right so much. The superstars of psi.
I was going to say, do you hold those two separate? Do you hold the alien hypothesis as one category and consciousness as the other? And those are two, right? Because there's a universal mind, there's like idealism, and then you have maybe these alien creatures are also a creation of whatever that is or a manifestation of that. Just like we are, but they happen to create us, like the whole simulation theory, like what made us. I don't know. I get lost in it really fast, but I'm really interested because you've done so much methodical research. How are you looking at these two things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm compelled to the idea that, the fundamental universe is conscious, that consciousness is in the fabric of reality itself. So that on some level, the stone, the table, everything is interlinked and is conscious in a way that I can't necessarily fathom, but we know going down to the smallest levels, like quantum mechanics. I'm not going to pretend I'm not a quantum mechanics guy, but my understanding is that at that level, there's no way to tell the table from the floor or from me, right? There's just this quantum soup. So we are all interlinked. That's not just a kind of a new agey concept, that we are all interlinked in a very fundamental way. That in fact, we seem to be almost the same thing, just this one same thing that's, it's the whole cosmos. So if there's consciousness in those things, then it should be shared in some way. It should be throughout that fundamental fabric. That's my view. So consciousness is fundamental, and therefore consciousness is everywhere, and that we have arisen from this consciousness that we might think of as a primal creative force. People can give that a name if they want, but that everything has emerged from it in a dreamlike fashion. Our universe, I see as a kind of a dreamlike emergence from that. I've seen it described as like a holographic 3D kind of world that's emerging from the two-dimensional surface of the cosmos or something really weird like that, we perceive it this way, but that's not how it is. Same as the idea that space-time is doomed. The space-time is a concept that we have. It's not fundamental reality, and that's on its way out as well, because basically space-time is also not real. It's something that we experience because of the way we are. And the fundamental level, I think, is consciousness itself, and that there's that quantum soup is the universe, and that we are all psychic in the mind. In what surprises me actually then from that view is not that people are psychic, it's that they're not as psychic as they should be, and that it's not everyone being super psychic. So because the amazing thing is the filtering of reality that occurs in the brain that allows us to experience being cut off individuals. That's the miracle. It's not people having psychic powers, because in fact, we should otherwise all have this unbelievable connection to all things and almost like know everything everywhere all at once and know everyone's thoughts and feelings because we're part of everything. So why don't we know everything and experience everything? That's the mystery to me, is that actually we should be more psychic, all of us. So it's funny that only some people seem to have these reduced filters. And that's why if you look at the work, like Anthony Peake's work, particularly great researcher, that it's more about filters, that we seem to have some sort of cognitive filtering. And when you have a near-death experience or certain other events, those filters go. What people say, I knew everything everywhere all at once, right? And then if they come back to the body, they're sort of told, you're going to forget it all, and it all goes. Otherwise, your life would be pointless because you would know everything all at once. You wouldn't gain anything. So it does seem that actually our real state of being is everything everywhere all at once, knowing everything. As soon as we get out of this physical body and we return to being consciousness, we basically are back jacked into the source and into this fundamental reality. When we're in a body, the brain, the body is acting as some kind of filter that stops us being overwhelmed with all of existence and allows us to function as an individual. But we retain some of that connection, and some people retain more of it than others. They have depleted filters, and that can give you schizophrenia in some cases. In other cases, you can be a profoundly psychic, like shaman, and you're seeing things all the time. And my wife's a shaman; she sees things all the time. That could be very uncomfortable. And you're going through life in a very different way to everyone else because your filters are greatly reduced. And also in autistic people, it seems like filters are often greatly reduced, and that they're experiencing reality very differently to other people. And that's, for example, again, I know we're going to see silent, but with autistic people, in some cases, like people on the spectrum, because of them not being able to really distinguish themselves as distinct from other people and objects, that they can't relate to them in the same way and have the emotions that go with that connecting to something other, because they don't perceive it as being something other, that is part of the extension of themselves. Like their shoes may be part of themselves. They can get attached to objects, the table. Oh, no, you can't go to the table. It's part of me, right? Because everything here is part of me, right? So if you think about it, there's a lot of disturbance for some neurodivergent people. If you try to take away things in their familiar environment, it's almost an attack on them because you are ripping away a piece of them, right? And that's what they're saying with the complexities about their emotional connections to people, because they're not experiencing you as other in the way that you're experiencing them as other. So they don't need to have that same share of emotion to feel the connection. So there's some of these things we're seeing in neurodivergency fit with this filters model that, so schizophrenia is a lowering the filters in a way where too much is coming in and they're overwhelmed. And they have all these visionary stuff and voices and weird stuff, and sometimes psychic kind of stuff happening, and mystical stuff happening. And one of the things that people often say when you say aliens created us, well, aren't you just kicking the can down the road because, but who created the aliens? And, that's one of the most common things people say. And it's almost that it's like, well, I'm not trying to resolve how life began. I'm not, right? I'm not trying to resolve how the universe began. I have some thoughts on it, like I say, I'm going to offer to you, but that's not what I'm trying to resolve. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to study one area of that story and move our knowledge back one step without having to explain the whole damn thing, because we don't normally do that in any other field. So it's a strange argument to say, but Bruce, you're just kicking the can down the road. Who made the aliens? Well, I'm just amazed that aliens modified us. Do I need to explain where the aliens came from for it to be amazing? Like, why? Why would I need to explain? And how would I begin to if we can't communicate with those aliens and ask them or have their body to analyze? Why would I be able to say where they came from? Yeah. I mean, it's a really strange, it's just, I understand why people ask it, but it's a strange counter argument to why this would be important. Almost as if, what a waste of time. All you've done is shown aliens are real and modified us. You didn't even show how life began. I mean, what? Really? I have to solve the entire story of existence just to make this worth thinking about?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's strange.
It's very strange.
Yeah, that's how we are, I guess. It's kind of, we have these thoughts, and at the time, unless someone brings us up on it, we wouldn't see why it's absurd, because I have to sort of say to them, well, think about it. I mean, that's normal science. In loads of topics, we just move a step back. We don't necessarily resolve the whole damn thing. And I'm not trying to dispel God or, make a new religion. So therefore, I don't have to give you that, because I'm not trying to, there's not an agenda where, well, I'm going to supplant God with aliens or something like that. So, but God still made the aliens. It's like, well, I don't know, maybe. I'm not saying. I don't know. I'm not saying either way. I'm really not. Could be. Yeah, could be.
Do people need to be careful when you start talking about this paranormal stuff or aliens? I mean, do you view, because you're talking about aliens are still here, are you envisioning that in like a form of a hybrid human being walking around that we just don't know? Or like Nolan, I believe, Gary Nolan was talking about how a friend, I think he mentioned this in a podcast, like picked up something on a camera, but it seemed to be like non-physical. I mean, are these things able to access this consciousness better so we can't detect them and they're living kind of here? I know this is another like huge like jump into a rabbit hole type of conversation, but how do you picture their presence still being here?
Firstly, I mean, obviously the initial description we've been given in this information was they were underground. So, and also if they're obviously underground and in ships, if they're external, then there's no particular reason why we would directly see them most of the time. So if the main places where they were, the facilities where they're in, are either deep underground and hidden from us, or in space and hidden from us and actively able to evade us, we wouldn't necessarily often see them. Of course, there's the UFO phenomena suggestive that at least in some cases, their technologies are encountered by people. I can't say that's absolutely the case, again, because we haven't got that technology to analyze. But if we take some credit to all of the witnesses, then it would fit with the idea of a long-term presence of a high technology civilization in our solar system. That if these things flying around, at least in some cases, really are craft or appear to be, are some kind of controlled phenomenon. Sometimes orbs of light that can change into, we don't really know what those things are, holograms, but it does seem that some of what's being encountered would fit with a highly developed technological civilization that can spoof us and that can make things appear to be almost whatever they want, right? Mm-hmm. Then we could encounter them hidden. And like people say, they've seen things turn into helicopters. They're like craft, and then they turn into black helicopters, or they turn into orbs of light. And if there's something that's that far ahead of us, that was like, if you think about it, if 800,000 years ago, there were two groups that had spacefaring technologies, giant megastructures, genetic engineering technologies to make new species. What are they like now? I mean, what are they like now? So I think certainly the old adage of, any significantly advanced technology would appear like magic to us would definitely fit after all that time, that it would be magic. And I don't know that unless they wanted you to see it, that there'd be any conceivable way to detect it. Because obviously, if you know all about a species, if somebody's been watching you the whole time, they know all what you can do. They know if they want to counter you, how to counter you. They know how to avoid you. They know how you think. They know how you dream. So they would know you much better than you know yourself, because they know even how you got here. The whole bloody thing. So I think we would have a difficulty ascertaining their presence. Absolutely. And also, if they have this ability to appear in different forms, countering our perceptions, that's another problem. And an additional element to that is, I don't know if you know, there's a book about how evolution has hidden reality from us. And I've forgotten the guy's name, but
yes.
Yeah. And so we have this other problem, that if there is phenomena or objects, anything that is in our environment, that over a vast period of time has played no significant role in our survival and our reproduction, that we would be able to perceive, that it had no role. It wasn't providing food. It didn't help you get a mate. It didn't kill you and eat you, that we may have evolved to a point where we essentially don't detect it. It's no longer, all of our systems have changed to focus on the things we need for survival. So now if there was this other thing here, that all it does is kind of watches us and just does stuff we can't conceive of, that we wouldn't know it does to us, that we may evolve sensory equipment that no longer can detect it accurately. And it may, if we can detect it at all, we render it in very strange ways. And that's when you see all the UFO phenomena, that people seem unable to render these things in a consistent way. That they look and somebody says, I'm seeing a star thing. And someone says, no, I saw an orb. And I see this. We have groups of people. One said, I didn't see anything. Two of them, I saw this thing and it was profound. The other, I didn't see anything at all. So that is strange, because you'd think if we were talking about a fixed physical object like a metal spaceship, why wouldn't everyone just see it?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we all just see the metal spaceship the same?
Yeah.
So why is it that sometimes the different people, are seeing them differently? And why the myriad of different shapes and types? Mm-hmm. I think it was John Keel that said, the UFO researcher said that he's seen there was a monster and a craft for each of us. Because there was so many different types of aliens and craft that it was absurd, just absurd, that you could be a civilization and come in and it's got hundreds of different kinds of crafts and and different beings. It just seemed absurd. So it's much more likely that this is a cognitive issue, that we are unable to accurately perceive, or it's countering our perceptions and it's projecting whatever it wants in front of you. and particularly if it can hack your sense of reality. So if something is doing, say, brain to, like AI or brain to brain transfer, and can hack your neurology, so the optic nerve and the sensory sections of the brain, right? If that something can give you another feed of reality, right? So imagine, so you won't even know necessarily this has happened, but you've been hacked, and it's now projecting a visual and auditory feed where you believe that you're still walking in the woods, seeing this triangular craft and these grays, but if someone walked past you, they would just see you standing frozen, doing nothing at all. And there would be nothing around. They wouldn't see anything, just you were zoned out, because you are being fed that experience in a cloned reality setting. And why do I feel that's very likely happening? Because one of the descriptions of these close encounters that's very common is a discontinuity of sound. The people say that, suddenly the birds went silent, the bugs went silent, you couldn't hear the road noise, and then the being was there, and everything else was the same. But I feel that in that moment, in that feed, that they've left a little inconsistency, and that's the sound, because it's not considered important. That they've created a visual communication, an audio communication. So you've got a being talking to you, or telepathy to you, whatever, and you're seeing it, and it looks like you're still in the woods. And so what other consistency is missing time. Mm-hmm. If you were entranced, you've got no idea how long you've been there. No idea. You don't know if they've done this to you compacted in a microsecond data download, or whether they've had you there all afternoon. You'd have really no way of knowing that, because this is all direct going onto your brain in whatever fashion that they would want. A technology like that, which is conceivable, because again, we're going towards all this brain hacking now. A technology like that, you can make people believe essentially anything, right? You can make them see the Battlestar Galactica landing in front of them. You can make them believe that the sky gods have chosen you, whatever you want. Yeah. If you get to that level where you can give someone what feels like a totally real experience, and we know these feel real because people have PTSD, real PTSD after these experiences, no matter how imaginary-ish they may be, you will experience it as real. So I think these are technological events, that this is brain hacking by a presence and intelligence that's here, that gives us these experiences for unknown reasons, shaping us, seeing what we do, testing us, and that we have these experiences and people experience them as real. But I think you'll find that in most of these cases where they have the missing time and they saw this stuff, they didn't go anywhere. They didn't go to, Alpha Centauri on a day trip on the saucer. They didn't leave the car. The car stalled, they've blacked out, and that whatever these technologies are, that you are given these experiences. So that's the level, I think, of superiority of technology that I suspect we're dealing with, based on some of these inconsistencies, like the sound thing. So I think the big hint is you lost the feed of reality when the birds stopped singing, that you are no longer in objective reality. It may look like a perfect clone. I know that people say it's hyper real. It was realer than real life, the same as the NDEs. Yeah. Realer than real life is a kind of hyper reality in these other states. And the same sort of thing is said in some of these alien contact events. And also sometimes people say they look holographic. They say the beings almost look like holograms and stuff like that. So if you scour through the contact material, I think we're seeing the handiwork of that. And I don't think this is all lots and lots of different kinds of beings. Maybe, but I think you could narrow it down to, you don't need to have one. If there's one that can make you see almost anything, we don't need lots. Two, being generous, I think, it could be why we don't see a complete takeover or whatever you want. If there is two powers that are in a kind of a cosmic war, a cold war that influence worlds, have different perspectives, that'd be enough to hold us in a kind of a stasis while we are being left to choose. And this is again why I suspect we are left to choose through how we live and our actions, which side we are aligning with in this Cold War. So again, this is something that's come out of my research, is the suggestion. And this again is in our own mythology. You're given this choice, like by the devil, these kind of stories that you choose at the crossroads, and you're going to go with this one. And some of the old stories, the Watchers are the same. There's a an experience that one of the biblical figures had. And I'm not, saying that that's real necessarily, but he says, and in my vision was the Watchers, and there was one with a face like a viper. And he said his name was Belial, he said, I'm Belial, I'm Lord of darkness and all things that are, bad or whatever. And the other one is, he says, I'm the Prince of Light. And he's basically Michael. And he says, and he looks pretty much like a human, right? He looks fairly human-like. The other one looks quite reptilian-like. And he said, and they say, you sort of have to choose which of us do you want to rule over you. And so, these really weird kind of stories in our mythology, in our history, and in the occult, this idea that there's different forces here that are kind of vying for us in some strange game, that we can't fathom, like why they would give a crap, but they seem to, for some reason, have this narrative of there's always, a good and a bad, or a slightly better and a slightly, we can judge whether it's good or bad. But it may be that, that what we're seeing is this continuance of a very old situation, in the same way that the one was here, blew up the other one's ship, that this is a much older story. And they suggest there has been wars in the cosmos, in the same information suggests there's been wars in the cosmos that have been fought across, vast periods and vast areas of space that we know nothing about, and that these forces still exist, and that we are living in the middle of it all. I mean, it's a wild, wild concept. But at the same time, if we look at the long history of accounts by human beings, right into deep prehistory, of what they say they're experiencing and what they describe, and this idea of, vying for us, it's all there. You know what I mean? I'm not saying we have to believe them, but it's all there in all these global myths and, global religious systems. And like I said, that, it does dovetail into religion, that we see the same kind of narratives in our main religions. Have those grown out of those experiences with encountering these technologies that can give you visual imagery that's just like bonkers, like what was it when they had the mystery of the sun, Abergore, the mystery where the sun, basically the sun started flying round and round, and there was the group of children as they were channeling the Divine Mother. I've forgotten the name of the place, but and they said there's the profound mystery of the sun, where for about an hour or so, there was all these things like the sun seemed to fly around in the sky, and there was thousands of witnesses. Is it Medjugorje? I think it was.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
one of the Catholic kind of church investigating everything, but there like thousands of people were there, and they saw the sun flying around. So, like, what is going on there? Because we can't accept that the sun was just flying around the sky. We can't, but is it possible there's a technology that can project to 1,000 people or more at a time, that you see that happening? Because again, we have to have an explanation that fits better with science than that they really saw the sun flying around. We know they saw something because there were skeptics there, journalists, scientists, people who had turned up to debunk the whole mystery of these children, right? They had turned up specifically to say this was nonsense. So they came on the day when it was all predicted, something great was going to happen. And they all saw it. They all saw the mystery of the sun. The sky ripped, and the sun flew around, and just wild stuff. And how do we explain that everyone has this collective delusion, including the skeptics? Yeah. Right. And if that is not actually the physical sun flying around, what could make people see that? So can we be manipulated on a group scale to see things, aren't there? Again, some of this is kind of horrifying. Don't get me wrong.
Because you don't know what's real at that point. Like,
right.
The whole undercurrent of everything you believe, and that's when you talk about disclosure and societal breakdown. It's like, if everything was a lie, how would you respond? Yeah.
Now you can start to see why some of this is potentially real problems, right? Because too often in the ufology world, we have some very simple narratives, and people don't explore in depth some of these potentials. They're not really considered. It's usually very simplistic. But when you start to extrapolate outwards to the kind of what seems to be the potential abilities of whatever it is that's here, based on history, the claims, experiences, how these technologies we're working on can be projected outwards. Yeah, the you could get to a point where, look at Jacques Vallée's idea of the control grid, that we live in some kind of control grid. And that's what he came to that conclusion years and years. First of all, he thought his aliens were here and blah, blah. And then he came to the idea that actually it seems to be too strange. The same as Keel, these guys were top researchers in the field. They came to the conclusion that it was something else, either interdimensional or that there's some kind of control system or paranormal element to this that is to do with our mind and how we perceive things, because it doesn't fit just with alien explorers landing and making contact. It just does not. That there is something that has been long standing here that seems to mess with us and mess with our minds and has like magician-like abilities to deceive us. And that fits better with something that, can project imagery, either superimposed into reality, so we have like an augmented reality, or, and again, it doesn't have to be just or, it can be and, can project information direct to you, but not just to you, groups, and we don't know the number. So is the number 1,000? Is the number 8 billion? If it's 8 billion, then we've got a real problem, haven't we? That, like you say, we've got no way to know then where we are in terms of from base reality to what's happening. If it's the control grid can project to 8 billion people in real time, then it's anyone's guess where we are, what's going on, where am I now? What's this room? What's any of this, right? We'd have no idea. And so you can see how perhaps if you were in some kind of secret project or you'd gone down this road, but you'd found perhaps objective evidence at some point in your work, you'd found objective evidence that pointed to something like that, something on that scale, that would you or would you not have some serious reservations about how you bring that to the public, or if you ever should, or if you even could? What if you tried? What's done to you? Why hasn't anyone else? You'd have these questions. Well, if someone else has found it, why didn't they bring it out? Were they immediately deleted from reality? Because if you even try, it would you'd certainly have some conundrum, right? Like, how would you go up against something that could have that kind of power? You would be going up like an ant against, a tank. It's just, the scale of that. I don't know that many would have the bravery if they had the objective proof where they could potentially show that it was something like that. Like, they would have a serious conundrum as to whether and how you would show that objective evidence to everybody else.
Yeah, because I had these comments on some of the stuff I was posting with Dr. Masters, and somebody was still coming on and going like, "Oh no, Jesus is still God." Like, that was their comment, and I feel like going, no, like that's not what everybody's talking about. They're talking about like if you strip away like all that's a lie. Like, people don't even want to go there mentally. Like, I grew up Catholic, but I can take myself to a place where like it could all be a lie. Like, the fabric of your reality could be a lie. It could be all a manifestation or a projection or whatever else. So then I don't think, like, to your point, many people want to do that. It scares them. It rocks their world. And so it makes you wonder, this whole disclosure thing, if it's just this facade and it's never going to happen because the powers that be, whether that's human or not human, don't want it to be.
Well, yeah, and you go think if you could come to the conclusion that above your power structure sits another hierarchy, and that it's present and it has a real ability to interact, and that you even know it has a place above you to do things, or you can see the potential for it, that would also keep you somewhat in your place, wouldn't it? I mean, you would be hesitant then to go up against the boss if you realize that, oh, geez, it turns out that we're below the type 3 civilizations representatives in this solar system. And apparently they want us to do what we're doing now and not step out of line or something. But then the population is pressuring you, saying, but we found this evidence, something weird's going on. And so you're in this kind of weird conundrum where you think, well, you can't totally ignore that, particularly because science is moving forward. As scientists, you can't say the whole scientific community is on board, right? Giant conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. And yet all these revolutions are moving forward and they're starting to detect evidence that something is wrong. Right? In the same way that we're now detecting the genome, it's wrong. There's something really wrong in there. And there's something wrong about these tektites and stuff. There's things wrong about metals that are being found, like Gary Nolan, Dr. Nolan's work, and Valerie, metals that seem to have isotopic ratios that suggest that they were made for unknown purposes at billions of dollars expense and dripping out of weird crafts, apparently, that people have seen. like super weird situation. So as that evidence starts to accrue, if you're in that hierarchy, I mean, now whether you are interacting with these beings directly or not, there has to be a point where you're like, something's going to break here. Like, do you release the steam by constructing a situation that allows those people to be validated and say, yes, by Jove, you're right. There's something super weird going on. It turns out that there is this. It's this craft, and we found this, and yes, aliens have been here, and you may go to something like that and let off the steam, so everyone's like, they're happy, and the scientists are like, we always thought there was probably life, and I always knew that metal was, they'll go to that. They'll be like, I always knew it was real, and then behind that is the real situation. But the thing that you're showing is so profound and it is so satisfying that for all those people who can finally say, I told you idiots, I was right, and they get their day right in the sun where, yeah, screw you, Mick West, and the skeptics, right? Because that's what a lot of them want, give them their day. But would they be so happy if it was anything like the scenario we were just discussing? I don't think that they would be quite so jolly about that. Not at all. And so it's questionable whether someone in that hierarchy could take a benevolent view where they think, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy to live in that reality. Mm-hmm. Or a malevolent like to be where they say, well, I know the aliens will kill me, so I'm not letting them find out the actual truth because God help us, the boss will come down, Yeah. I don't want to meet the boss, right? So, you know what I mean? You can see how either of those scenarios would put pressure on someone in that hierarchy to think, I'm not letting it get to that. Let's give them enough bread and circuses that they're kind of satisfied. And if the bread and circuses is crash dealing crafts, how extraordinary is the actual truth? Mm-hmm. If that is the thing to distract you from it, and they have to go as far as kind of having people come out and saying, yes, there's alien crafts and we've had them for years. If that's what's letting off the steam, then that would really insinuate there's something really hella weird in the background that they don't want to bring out, and that would either destabilize the entire planet or fundamentally, cause us psychotic episodes, on a grand scale. And that is totally possible. I think that with these kind of what we're touching on, these kind of and these fit with the ideas of things like that we live in samsara, an illusion, the Maya, this illusionary reality, the Buddhist or other, that we're basically conjuring this all up, that perhaps nothing is as it seems at all, and that we have not only been evolving to perceive in a certain way, but have been directed to evolve and perceive in that way that limits us seeing the boss, and seeing the control grid and what's going on around us, and keeps us nice and calm. Because if we actually could perceive the structure of our world and what's happening, that you couldn't function in the same way the NDE person couldn't function if they knew all about the cosmos in their human body. Yeah. So when you're in it, you don't remember all that stuff. You couldn't function. I think on a grander scale, our species couldn't function if it has the profound knowledge of how Earth is actually run or working, and what we're doing here as souls experiencing this life, that there is mysteries beyond that would make this an untenable experience for us, because you'd only be thinking about that. You'd only be thinking about what's going on with that control grid, and these beings or all these forces, and, is my house real? Is any of this, how would you function in that?
That's where I am right now. I'm like sitting here going, oh shit.
Right. Just having that conversation. I always feel like apologizing about talking to you and the audience about it, because, it's one of those things where if you go into that route, it makes the ufology topic seem tame.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a moment right now where it's like a red pill and a blue pill. And it's like you're giving an avenue to look into what's potentially there, but it's so scary and unsettling to people that they're going to revert back to there's normalcy. I want my house. I want to look about what shoes I'm going to get, what phone I'm going to buy, what I'm going to do for dinner tomorrow night. That can keep people sane. But I mean, I've been talking to you for like 3 hours now. I can't tell you how fascinating this has been.
Yeah, sorry. I know it's been long.
No,
yeah.
I love this. The only other conversation I've had like this is like with Bernardo Castro. And we sat down for like, it was like a few hours. We just kept talking. And I find these so gratifying, and I can't thank you enough for like spending the time to lay out the backstory and to really, because you really grasp the current stuff if you go back and talk about the earlier stuff. So thank you for that. But I guess one last question for you would be, so how do you see disclosure coming? Do you see it coming? And in light of everything we just talked about, will it even mean anything?
Yeah, I mean, with disclosure, I guess I look at it and say I do feel they're going to have to now take it to some kind of conclusion, because it's got to this bit with, it's in Congress, they're talking about alien crafts, so they either have to tie it up with we've looked really hard and we haven't found it and there's nothing that, and try to put it all, normalize it, bring it all up as a big topic and then really, really debunk it, to strongly debunk it. And show that, we've looked everywhere, all these facilities, all of these stories we've checked, and it turns out it's wrong. And these people are being fired because they were delusional or they made up stories to get money, and they're all getting fired, the ones that were involved, and, we're investigating, to really try and stamp it all back down. That's one direction it could go. It could be that they do that. Or it goes down a path where it gets to starting to tell us a story. And again, I don't know how much evidence we'll get, but continuing with telling us a story that gets more and more kind of profound about alien intelligences. Meanwhile, they seem to be bringing in levels of technology that are so kind of controlling dystopian, like, digital currencies and AI control, that there may be a point where it just doesn't matter anymore about what story you tell us, because we won't be able to disagree with them anyway. So It's almost like we just tell you the story and keep you engaged while they get all the other stuff in place to where it no longer matters what we say to you or show you, because you'll be so digitally enslaved that they will never have to show you their conclusion. They could keep it going forever, and you will basically be powerless, because that's the other thing. We're living in this time where, do you know what I mean? This stuff is happening alongside it. So there may be a point where they're under no pressure to do anything for us or to tell us anything, or so it just will come to a conclusion of them telling us stories indefinitely and nobody will be able to do anything about it. And that could be wild stories about, aliens, and it could veer off into consciousness topics, who knows? But my concern would be that could just be totally artificial, like an almost entertainment, just keep us going with the bread circles of more examinations of these topics and more whistleblowers. And, will that just string out with more and more hearings, but not really taking you to evidence, while the real problems of a growing dystopian control grid are brought in to manage us in a way where we don't even have the power anymore to complain about, have you got secret projects? Because we will have nobody, be too scared to even ask the government questions anymore, because they're watching you through all of your systems, and that they can turn you off, turn off your credit, and turn off, you know what I mean? So
that's bleak.
I think it's bleak. So I think that's, we have to depend a lot on, will humans accept being plugged into a control grid where we basically have no power to hold government accountable? Right. In which case, like I say, these stories could just get wilder and baseless and just tell us whatever they want. Or we start to take back some of our power, in which case there's more pressure that we can actually apply to find out what is the truth behind this. And in which case we may well get to the objective evidence that shows at least whether aliens are here, because that's the narrative on offer. So we may be able to then retain some autonomy to be able to pressure these systems to find out what's going on, and hopefully start to subvert these systems being more in the people's hands, where we can really check for ourselves what the hell's going on and stop living under people that don't give two craps about us and that have been lying to us, since day dot. And so I think we need a radical system change to really answer these questions, because I don't think that the system isn't trustworthy. We know that from what's happened to Assange, the investigation system, the stuff that's come out with leaks, we know the system isn't trustworthy, and it doesn't hold itself to account. Nobody went to jail for the Iraq War, the lies and stuff like that. So, I mean, they can tell us endless lies in the current system, and the worsening dystopian control grid will allow that to be indefinite. So, I mean, that's the bleak version. So, so I think it's going to depend a lot on us. We can get some real answers as long as we don't go down into the trap where we just listen to all these stories, and not just on this topic, all sorts of social issues we're seeing right now. They're diverting our attention from the main problem of our biometrics, our data, our autonomy, our money, and how we're being pied into a system that is very dystopian. And conversely, so that's why I think the reality is going to depend on our choice now as to what kind of system we're willing to live in, as to whether we get the truth. And that I think the truth should be that there's evidence of another intelligence here. I think there'll be objective evidence is somewhere in these systems, or endless stories, a worsening dystopia, and them not having to really reveal anything at that point. Just we get told to believe whatever they want us to believe, and we go along with it because we don't want a problem.
And if anybody wants to know more about you, where can they find? I think you have a Substack and your Twitter page. Where can people go to check out more of your work and read up on you? And we'll put all the links to your books in the description below as well.
Sure, yeah. Hopefully I haven't frightened them too much from looking at it. There's nothing too bad in there. But yeah, Substack, brucefenton.substack.com. So I've got about 9 pieces so far on the details of this project. Alientechnosignatures.com is the project hub for where I'm collaborating with the other scientists to look for the additional objective evidence for that visitation. And that's we've got some funding, but obviously more funding is great if people want to contribute, or they want to contribute time. If you're a scientist and you feel that those topics were relevant to you, feel free to reach out. Also on Twitter, I'm there too much. I need to cut that back, but you can find me at geological SETI. It's my handle on there, but yeah, I do it too often. But yeah, that's where you probably will find me ranting, on various subjects. And also my books are on Amazon. So if anyone wants to look for either The Forgotten Exodus or Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, those 2 books are both on Amazon. And obviously you can go into a bookshop and order them. They put it on the shelves, but you can order them in any good bookshop.
Cool.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. And super appreciate you having me on. And I hope that, it's food for thought. I know it's quite long and I know it's a lot of topics. So hopefully it's something for everyone.
Oh, I love this stuff. It's been fascinating. I've wanted to cover it for a long time, and it's just been finding the right people to kind of delve into the subject, because it is kind of like a sea of chaos when you trying to get information and get people who are taking it seriously, looking at it scientifically, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you so much, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and our other social media platforms to stay updated with our latest content and join our awesome community. You can find the links right down below in the description, and also feel free to check out these suggested videos popping up right now. We'll see you at the next one. Learn, prepare, survive.